The Great Confession. Prologue. In the sky between continents, where time dissolves between time zones and the soul seems suspended between worlds, there lived a woman who loved with one wing as a pilot and the other as a mother. Her name was Élodie Moreau, a name spoken with respect in aviation, but spoken with fear, longing or silent admiration in the lives of those she touched without ever remaining fully. She was an officer, a wife, a lover, a traveler. She was a puzzle of identities, carefully constructed, from risky pieces and fragments of hidden truths. In every country, in every love, she left a trace. Sometimes, the trace was a smile in a photograph, sometimes it was a child, a daughter born from a moment of passion and abandoned in the arms of a loving father.Seven daughters.Seven worlds.Seven continents of the heart. This story is not an ordinary one, not it begins with a once upon a time, and does not end with they lived happily ever after. Rather, it is a diary written in silence, on the margins of aeronautical charts, in hidden calendars, in unsent letters and flights that never appeared in official records. It is a confession torn from a double, sometimes triple life, in which lying was the only form of protection. On the day she told her story, Élodie did not ask for forgiveness. She did not defend herself. She looked into the camera, recorded her voice and spoke the truth, raw, deep, human. For the first time, she wasn't the impeccable pilot, the iron woman, the loyal wife, or the absent mother. She was a woman who lived defying the rules of gravity, not just of flight, but of the heart. This is the Great Confession. Not to judge, not to excuse, but to understand how far a woman can fly when she's not allowed to land anywhere. Chapter 1. The Interview. It was a quiet July morning, and Paris, with its warm lights and the scent of jasmine from the gardens on the banks of the Seine, seemed to sigh under its own memory. In a chic apartment in the 7th arrondissement, en rue de l'Université, a 79-year-old woman was meticulously smoothing her sky-blue linen dress, watching the world go by without knowing anything about her. Her name was Élodie Moreau, a name that had once appeared on the covers of aviation magazines, in official speeches and in image-controlled interviews. Known as the first female flight captain on Airbus A380 aircraft for Air France, Élodie had been the symbol of elegance in uniform, of technical perfection and of French refinement in the international skies in the 80s and 90s, but no one knew the truth. Not the deep, dirty, immoral and sublime one at the same time. About 10 minutes past 5, the doorbell rang delicately in the hallway, between a photograph of a young woman in the cockpit and a stone statuette from A. Flight to Nairobi. A young shadow appeared, carrying a backpack and a nervous smile. Bonjour, Madame Moreau, I'm Camille Laurent, from Le Figaro magazine. Thank you for inviting me. Come in, Camille. You should know that I didn't call you for a story, I called you for a will, a living one. Camille, in her 30s, a promising but still uncertain journalist, raised an eyebrow. It wasn't the first time an elderly personality had wanted to tell her about her life, but something in Élodie's voice seemed different. Authoritarian, but full of mystery. The living room she invited her to was an oasis of memories. Above the fireplace, an old Jaeger LeCoultre clock ticked slowly on the round cherrywood table, a tray of mint tea and lavender cookies. Everything smelled calm, but there was something disturbing about Élodie's gaze. Camille, did you know that I have 7 daughters?Seven. No, I just knew that. You never talked about children. Of course. Because each one has a different father. And none of them were raised with me. They were all born in different parts of the world. And none of them knew about the others, until a few years ago. Camille was left with her pen suspended in the air. I'm sorry, I don't understand. No, you can't understand. The world won't understand either. I was a goddess of the air with a soul of sin. And I want to tell you my story, but write it down only after I can't read it anymore. The sound of the recorder starts recording is the only sound, apart from the wind rustling the leaves in the interior garden. Élodie sits down in her worn leather armchair, while Camille takes out a notebook and begins to note down details of the atmosphere. I was born in 1946, in Marseille. I was a child, good in appearance, but with a mind that never slept. At 17, I was already winning international martial arts tournaments. My father was a mechanic and my mother a seamstress. They always told me that I couldn't dream too high, so I took flight. Literally. Where did your passion for aviation come from? From an accident at 20. I saved a little girl from a bus that had fallen into a ravine. There was chaos, panic, but I knew what to do. Then, a pilot in the area told me, "You have pilot blood." It was like a revelation. From that day on, all I did was learn to fly. Élodie talks about her first years in aviation school, about how she was the only woman in a generation of 50 men. About how she faced them, surpassed them, taught many of them that respect does not come with gender, but with precision. At 30, I was a captain. At 32, I was at the forefront of transcontinental flights. But that's when my secret life also began. Camille slowly approaches. You mean? Yes, at 32, I married Colonel Armand Moreau. Handsome, elegant, a legend in the French army. We loved each other, but we didn't really know each other. I discovered that what I felt wasn't just desire. It was a hunger for life, for touch, for diversity. And once I flew to New York, Tokyo, Rome, Buenos Aires, each city became a new chapter of my desire. Élodie gets up and goes to a display case where she keeps 7 little boxes. She opens them one by one, showing a bracelet, a pacifier, a letter, a photo of a child. Each box is for one of my daughters. Each child was born out of love, Camille. Not out of sin. I loved every man who gave me a child. But I always knew that they shouldn't know each other. And Armand never knew. But how did you manage it? Because the sky makes you invisible. When you're an airline pilot and have 18-hour flights across the continent, no one asks what you do in your free time. I lived between heaven and earth. And in this intermediate space, I was free. Camille closes her eyes for a moment. She's overwhelmed. Story that defies convention, morality, but which is told with such lucidity and sincerity that it's impossible to condemn. Why now? Why are you telling me everything? Because I don't want to die with this secret. Because I want my daughters to know the truth. And because I was a woman who lived differently. Not perfectly, but fully. Camille looks at Élodie and no longer sees just an old woman. She sees a queen of heaven, a sinner in love with life, an imperfect mother, a mistress hidden in the flights. And she knows, from that moment, that what will be written in the pages of that interview will not be just an article. It will be an eternal confession. Chapter 2, Queen of the Air. In the 1970s, the world of aviation was a rigid universe, dominated by men's uniforms, strict protocols and a conservative view of the role of women in technical careers. In this landscape, where every movement was controlled with military precision, a phenomenon appeared that disturbed the dense air of prejudice. Élodie Moreau, an airline pilot, blonde, graceful, with an icy gaze and a fiery temperament. At the age of 32, Élodie became the first French woman to take command of a transcontinental flight on an Airbus A300, then, shortly, of a state-of-the-art aircraft, the Airbus A380, the supreme symbol of commercial aviation. The press called her the Queen of the Air, and her colleagues, whether they admired her or envied her, unequivocally recognized her authority in the cockpit. Not only because she was impeccable from a technical point of view, but because she inspired absolute confidence. However, before reaching that unofficial but emblematic title, Élodie's path had been marked by unseen struggles, by obstacles that did not appear in glossy CVs or in articles with romanticized titles. Born in Marseille, into a modest family, Élodie had been fascinated by flying since childhood. It was not just about airplanes. It was something deeper. The idea of dominating the sky, of defying gravity, of elevating her life above the limits imposed by society. At 16, she had joined a local martial arts club and, within a decade, had become world and Olympic champion in judo. Discipline, self-control and physical strength became her identity. She had been nicknamed the Tigress of the Mediterranean in the sports press, but she dreamed of something else, of flying a plane. Entering an aviation school in the early 1990s was, for a woman, an almost scandalous act of disobedience. On the first day of class, in a room with 52 men, Élodie had been greeted with ironic smiles and petty remarks. "You've got the wrong room, doll. The stewardess course is on the ground floor." But nothing would shake her. Within a year, she became the best in the group. She knew every part of the engines, recited the air communication codes from memory and had built reaction reflexes faster than any of her colleagues. She did exercises with an almost mathematical rigor, and the instructors, although surprised, had no choice but to admit she was the best. As she climbed the hierarchy, Élodie did not lose her femininity. But she did not flaunt it like a weapon either. She kept a sharp distance from the men around her, kept her hair tied up, spoke calmly and rarely, always impeccably dressed in her white and navy uniform. She was a presence that did not seduce, but imposed, and no man would have dared to whistle at her or make direct advances to her. She had a mixture of authority and refinement in her that cut off those who looked at her as a curiosity. When she was promoted to first officer on European races, a famous commander, known for his misogyny, he initially refused to fly with her. "I don't take to the skies with a woman at the helm," he said dryly. But after an emergency in which Élodie managed to correct an altitude error in a matter of seconds, saving a plane full of passengers from a potential collision, the same man went public and declared, "Moreau flies better than half the men in this sector, including me." That moment was defining. The press began to follow her. Aviation magazines headlined, "The first female captain in Europe to command an Airbus A380." And the world enveloped her in an aura of respect and fascination. But behind this legend built with sweat and genius, Élodie hid a battle on two fronts. One was with the air, with the systems, with the flight hours, with a constant pressure to perform flawlessly. The other was with herself. A deep, visceral hunger for sensation, for touch, for pleasure. She was aware that no one, would not even a moral deviation, could be forgiven. Women must be impeccable, especially successful ones, so she began to divide her life between airplanes and hotels, between the cockpit and the discreet rooms of cities around the world. She flew on intercontinental routes: Paris, New York, Tokyo, Paris, Nairobi, Buenos Aires, Rome, Sydney. Sometimes, she made 2 or 3 long stopovers in big cities. No one asked what she did during the 2 days of break between flights. Officially, she was resting, and in reality, she was living. Élodie was completely dedicated to her profession. She was a goddess of the air. She was never wrong, never late, never complained. Young pilots looked at her with admiration and fear. Passengers applauded her when she announced the landing. Little girl once asked for an autograph from her, saying, "I want to be like you when I grow up." "Don't be like me," Élodie replied with a smile, "be better." Her fellow pilots called her with respect and humor, the queen of the air, but behind the scenes they knew that no one could keep up with her precision and intuition in flight. She was considered a robot with a heart, a woman who knew how to lead a 600-ton ship like a jewel. In this context, she married Colonel Armand Moreau, a decorated officer, quiet, elegant, a man of honor and silence. Their relationship was built on mutual admiration, but not on passion. Armand looked at her like a star, beautiful, shining, but inaccessible. And Élodie needed more. But this more was kept secret. In her job, she could not be vulnerable. She hid her feelings with the same precision as she hid her mistakes. She lived between the sleeve and the mask. The Queen Élodie was, therefore, a woman between two worlds. On the one hand, she was the image of feminine success, of self-control, of absolute professionalism. On the other hand, she was the beginning of a personal myth, of a parallel life that only the sky truly knew. Each flight was more than an air race, it was an escape from what the world thought of her. And each city she landed in was a stage for another version of Élodie, woman with wings, but also with desires, queen not only of the sky, but also of her own destiny. Chapter 3. The Unquenchable Lust. There are desires that die out with their fulfillment. There are desires that disappear after consumption, like a flame extinguished by the wind. But in the case of Élodie Moreau, what she carried deep within her being was neither a momentary desire nor a passing whim. It was a thirst that knew no satiety, an inner fire that did not burn for destruction, but for intense living, a sophisticated nymphomania, masked by a rare intelligence and an almost impeccable professional life. In appearance, Élodie was the embodiment of elegance and perfection, a woman with eyes like the clear sky, blonde hair like the light filtered through the window of an airplane at 10,000 meters altitude, the body of a champion and the mind of a genius of coordination. She had been a model for generations of women, a symbol of emancipation. But in the privacy of her room, between flights and despite appearances, Élodie lived a parallel life, governed by a visceral need for touch, fantasy and abandonment. This thirst was not born of emotional emptiness or a past trauma. It was organic, part of her nature. She herself had said to herself in a diary from her youth, "I don't just love the idea of being desired, I love losing my identity in the desire of another, to feel the skin of the other like a new continent to explore. I don't want fidelity, I want fusion." Then liberation. It all started discreetly. She felt the first impulses during martial arts training, in adolescence, when physical proximity was part of the discipline. She felt a strange thrill in combat, not of fear or aggression, but of physical calling. It was neither fear nor sexual desire in the classical sense. It was a magnetism of the skin, an incomprehensible, uncontrollable attraction. During the years spent in school aviation, this desire turned into curiosity. She had several brief relationships with fellow pilots, all fascinated by her cold and cerebral charm. But each relationship ended the same way. Élodie tired of routine, of fidelity, of security. She always wanted something else. Not more. Just different. Then international flights came, and with them, the perfect opportunity for the life she had wanted, a life lived in fragments of time, in hotel rooms, in foreign skins and in well-calculated lies. Tea was a rule she respected with sanctity, never in France. Not in her husband's city. Not in the space where she might be recognized. Her marriage to Colonel Élodie Moreau was apparently solid, respectful, even tender in the rare moments they spent together. Armand adored her, but he never asked her too many questions. He was too disciplined to suspect, too honest to understand the lie. Do you have a flight to Tokyo? Yes, my dear. 2 days, we return via Seoul. I have a mission in Lebanon. See you in a week. And in that interval, in that empty space between two lives, Élodie became someone else. Not a liar, but a woman who divides herself into fragments, who lends her body and heart in measured doses of intensity. Flying around the world, cities became portals to new identities. In New York, she became sophisticated and sarcastic. She went to jazz bars, where she chose intelligent, introverted men with a melancholy look in their eyes. In Buenos Aires, she was passionate, dancing tango barefoot in a rehearsal room with steamed mirrors, in the arms of an urban matador who didn't even know her real name. In Nairobi, she wore loose clothes and tied her hair in a humble bun. She was attracted to calm men who spoke little and felt everything. In Tokyo, she was respectful, mysterious, almost silent, a modern geisha who gave in slowly, with refinement, offering herself without losing herself. In Sydney, she laughed freely. She swam naked in the ocean at midnight. She nestled in the arms of a surfer poet who called her the goddess of the waves. In Rome, she was artistic and theatrical. She let her painter lover paint her nudes in oil on old canvases. In Casablanca, she listened to Arabic poetry on high terraces, slowly smoking a hookah, while a man with dark eyes worshipped her in silence. But nothing was accidental. Every relationship was calculated. She protected herself with cold discipline. She never left her clothes with men. She only slept on her side of the bed. She didn't write letters. She didn't send pictures. She didn't answer messages between flights. And above all, she didn't promise them anything. You're mine, aren't you? I am of our time, that's it. Every time she left a city, a man would leave behind a memory and a taste of wine on his lips. But for Élodie, each encounter was an episode, not a promise, an adventure that fed her thirst, without quenching it. She didn't ask herself moral questions. She didn't feel guilty. She didn't think about the consequences. Her life was a perpetual flight, a woman between two time zones, queen without a kingdom, but with intimate maps drawn on her body. Sometimes, in the cockpits, between two announcements for passengers, while she controlled the flight and the pressure sensors, she felt the wave of desire rise in her chest. It couldn't be repressed. But it could be transformed into professional perfection. Flying had also become an erotic substitute for her. Speed, turbulence, risk, absolute control. They were part of the same inner mechanism that made her a woman and a goddess, an angel and a demon, a mistress and a captain. She often looked in the mirror and did not recognize a lost woman, but one who had found herself in every new skin she touched, in every accent, in every body language, in every part of the world. The only question that gnawed at her, in the rare moments of silence, was, how long can I fly without crashing? Because the desire did not fade, it diversified, it evolved, it always demanded something else. And somewhere, deep in her soul, Élodie had begun to feel that this double life, this balance between air and flesh, could not last forever. But until then, she still had dozens of flights to make, and other men to touch. Chapter 4. The Double Game. When you play on two fronts, you can never stick to a single truth. This was the unspoken rule that guided Élodie Moreau's life, rule she invented herself as the boundaries between reality and illusion blurred. A new level of her personality was revealed. Not just the woman with an unquenchable thirst for flesh and touch, but the master of manipulation, the woman who built her life on layered, precise, elegant, almost artistic lies. Between her career as a respected pilot and the adventures she had in hotel rooms around the world, Élodie had begun to feel a subtle pressure, a tremor that disturbed her clarity. It was the first time that lies were no longer completely safe. Either something in her had tired, or the game had become too sophisticated not to fail. It all began when Colonel Élodie Moreau, her seemingly gullible husband, noticed something that others would never have noticed: a vacant look, a delayed blink during dinner, a hesitation when she said she was flying to Lisbon, even though a massive storm had been announced there, and the company had cancelled flights to that area. "Did you say Lisbon?" "Yes. A one-day layover. After that, to Sao Paulo." "Curious. They cancelled all the flights. I was going to fly to the Atlantic too, but they announced a code red for that area." Élodie smiled quickly, elegantly, falsely. "Maybe they rerouted us. I don't know all the technical details. But the lie was too easy to tell." And that made Armand mentally note the first chink in her impeccable armor. And parallel, in Élodie's secret life, the game was becoming more and more dangerous. She had begun a strange, almost ritualistic relationship with a man named Julian de Vries, a Dutch diplomat with connections in the intelligence services. They only met in Berlin. The city had become their dark sanctuary. They didn't hold hands. They didn't say words of love to each other. But they possessed each other in silence, with an intensity that was unattainable. "You know you're being followed, right? By whom?" "By your real life." Julian was the only man who never asked her, "Where are you going?" but "Who are you today?" And this disturbed her. For the first time, she felt that she could see herself in his mirror and that her image was no longer under control. The double game no longer meant just a life between planes and lies. It also meant a network of subtle connections between people who were beginning to get dangerously close to each other. A reception organized by the French Air Force. Armand had been invited as a military representative, and Élodie, as a senior pilot, was already there. It was the first time that her husband and Julian de Vries, who had come as a diplomatic delegation, were in the same room. It was a brief but devastating moment. Armand and Julian shook hands. They looked at each other with the cold politeness of men who silently sense danger. And Élodie, caught between the two, felt her universe begin to tremble. "Do you know him?" Armand asked later, in a neutral tone. "I've only just met him. He has an authoritarian presence." "Yes. The kind who hides a lot." Without confronting her directly, Armand begins to create his own double game. He hires a private detective to track down discrepancies in his flight schedule. He checks the routes, discovers that some stopovers are fake. He begins to investigate further, not with anger, but with the sadness of a man who realizes too late that he is living with a stranger. At the same time, Julian expresses his dissatisfaction for the first time. "I can't pretend that I am just a stopover anymore." "Then leave the plane, Julian. I will fly on." "And if I shoot it down?" "You don't understand. I don't fly to get somewhere, but to not stay in one place." Julian then understands that he won't win this game. But he decides to teach her one last lesson. He leaves Élodie a photo, an image of her sleeping, naked, in his bed, with a note: "This is not a memory, it's a threat." Meanwhile, Armand finds out something that shakes him. Élodie had been recorded in a hotel room in Buenos Aires, with a false passport, under the name Claire Dupont. A friend in the secret services gives him the information. He still didn't have proof of marital infidelity, but he did have proof of a double identity. That night, Armand doesn't confront her. Instead, he invites her to dinner at his house. He lights candles. He tells her he loves her. And he gives her a gift, a necklace with blue stones. "You are beautiful and impenetrable, Élodie. Sometimes I feel like I don't know you at all. You don't have to know me. Just love me." "But what if I don't love a real person, but only a version created for me?" She remains silent. She doesn't know if Armand knows, but she knows that she can't fool him much longer. Between these two worlds, Julian, who asks her to stay, and Armand, who begins to investigate her, Élodie feels that the double game is turning into a dangerous game. She flees to Berlin, looking for Julian, but he has left. She left him only a file, dozens of photos, copies of passports, documents with her false name, and a note: "Now I know who you are. But do you know who you are becoming?" For the first time, Élodie feels fear. Not of being caught, but of losing control of her own narrative. And the next plane on the Cairo-Istanbul route, she misses the takeoff procedure by 2 seconds. The co-pilot looks at her strangely. It is the first mistake in 15 years. In the evening, Élodie stands in front of the mirror in her hotel room. She takes off the necklace Armand gave her and places it next to the photo Julian left. 2 symbols of the 2 worlds she lives in. And she says to herself, if the game becomes too real, it means that the stakes are no longer passion, but my life. The adventure ends with a phone call received in the middle of the night. Madame Moreau, we are from the Internal Service. We would like you to present yourself for a few questions regarding your activity outside of scheduled flights. And Élodie understands that the moment has come to choose. Either she gives up one of the 2 identities, or she will be buried by both. Chapter 5. The First Daughter of Heaven, New York. New York. The city that never sleeps, where airplanes dance among the skyscrapers and the lights seem to compete with the stars. Here, in an amber autumn, the first chapter of Élodie Moreau's hidden life was written. It wasn't the first time she had landed at JFK Airport, but this time, something in the air, a scent of change, an invisible tension, awakened her senses differently. It was 1981. Élodie was 33 years old, and in her Air France pilot uniform, with a sculpted face and blue eyes sparkling like the Atlantic's clear blue, she aroused admiration and shivers wherever she passed. She had just completed a transatlantic flight from Paris to New York, a flight attendant and a modern goddess of the sky and the luxury hotel in Manhattan, where the crew was staying. A meeting awaited her that would transform the soul forever. In the reading room on the 18th floor, overlooking Central Park, she met Jackson Carter, an American writer, famous for his novels about war, love, and identity. The man was tall with broad shoulders, a devastating smile and graying brown hair. He had the voice of an actor and the look of a man who observes everything but says nothing. He was 41 years old and a widower, something that Élodie found out that very evening, when their conversation, which began shyly over 2 glasses of wine, turned into a torrent of confessions, laughter and touches. They spent 4 days together. 4 days in which time dilated, and her ordered, controlled and divided life between flights and the discipline of a seemingly perfect marriage, collapsed in a whirlwind of passion. Jackson did not know that she was married. She did not tell him, nor she didn't intend to. With him, Élodie was just a free, vibrant woman, a brave of the sky, without a past and without limitations. Together they explored the city. They walked through Soho, ate ice cream in Brooklyn, climbed the Empire State Building at sunset, and at night they made love with an almost mystical intensity. He called her Sky Queen, and she had nicknamed him Heartsmith, for the way he seemed to carve her heart with every touch, every word. When she left New York, Élodie didn't know that she was already carrying the fruit of that meeting in her womb. She didn't want to tell Jackson. She knew that he would have wanted to stay by her side, but her world was a world with walls, with unwritten rules and a family in France that she wasn't ready to destroy. 9 months later, in a discreet clinic in Geneva, Élodie gave birth to a baby girl whom she named her Amélie, a name chosen not for fashion, but for the feeling of sweet melancholy she felt every time she remembered Jackson and the city that had given him to her. The little girl was raised by a close friend of Élodie, a childless woman who had agreed to be the legal mother in the documents, in order to keep the secret. Officially, Amélie was an orphan, but the reality was more complicated. Her biological mother came to see her once a month, under the guise of a distant relative. She brought her gifts, sang to her in French and taught her to look at the clouds with her eyes open. For Élodie, each flight to America became an opportunity to get closer to her child, but also a silent torment. She maintained her impeccable professionalism in the cockpit, but, in the privacy of her hotel room, she would sometimes cry, her hand pressed to her stomach, as if her body kept the memory of a loves that did not have time to mature. In parallel, life with her husband, Captain Armand Moreau, seemed unchanged. He was often away on special missions in Africa or the Middle East, a high-ranking officer in the French army, with a strategic mind and an almost fanatical devotion to honor. He offered Élodie stability, status and a quiet love, but he did not understand her in depth. He did not even ask for it. He considered her a symbol of prestige, the perfect woman who flew for Air France and sometimes appeared in aviation magazines. Élodie lived with 2 faces. 1, the wife of the exemplary Mark. The other, the mistress of hidden dreams. And from now on, the mother of a little girl who had Jackson's eyes and her smile, a devastating combination. Years passed, and Amélie grew up beautifully, often dreaming of airplanes without knowing why, looking at the sky as a promise, 10 years old, in a gesture that broke Élodie's heart. The little girl said to her, "Auntie Élodie, when I grow up, I want to fly planes, like you." She smiled with tears in her eyes, caressing her forehead. "Heaven awaits you, my love." The meetings between Élodie and Jackson ended abruptly. After a brief visit to Paris by the man, he tried to see her again, but she avoided him. He couldn't risk it. And yet, sometimes, in the middle of the night, when he flew over the ocean, he would look down at the dim light of Manhattan and feel a silent pain in his chest, an unfulfilled longing. He never forgave his silence. 79. In the interview given to the young journalist in her home on the shores of the Mediterranean, Élodie began the story exactly from that point. New York. The city where I discovered that you can love with your whole body, but still run away. That's where my first daughter, Amélie, was born. No one knew. Not him. Not my husband. Not the child. I lived with this secret for 45 years. The time had come to tell it. In an old album, he showed the journalist a black and white photo, a handsome man holding a woman in his arms. In front of a New York hotel, he had written on the back in small letters, "First love, first daughter, sky with 2 wings cut off." Thus opened the way to the other chapters of a life lived on a knife's edge, between sky and desire, between duty and passion. The first daughter of the sky had been the beginning of a dangerous dance, a chess piece played in all corners of the world. But no city remained in Élodie's heart like New York. There she not only lost her balance, but gave birth to her first living secret, a small soul, which would fly away one day, without knowing where it came from. It was just the beginning. Other chapters followed: cities, other men, other daughters. But Amélie remained the first daughter of heaven and the key to understanding a woman who, although she touched the clouds, never stopped burning inside. Chapter 6. Tango and Sin, Buenos Aires. After leaving the gray skies of Manhattan and leaving Jackson Carter with the memory of a lightning-fast love and an unknown daughter, Élodie Moreau resumed her winged journey through the world. In the impeccable uniform of an international airline pilot, with a company badge engraved in gold and her blue eyes shining with an endless thirst for the unknown, Élodie floated not only among the clouds, but also among the heartbeats of men who never knew who she really was. Her flight on the Paris-Buenos Aires route was a routine one, but Buenos Aires had never been an ordinary city. It seemed that tango and temptation were intertwined in the architecture of the city, and the streets danced to unseen rhythms that always attracted her into their webs. The city had the scent of a hazy dream, a mixture of strong coffee, cigar smoke, tropical rain and repressed passion. And the evening in who arrived, after a 13-hour flight, Élodie did not go to the hotel. She felt an inexplicable longing bubbling inside her, a need for something other than sleep, so she changed her uniform for a red silk dress, simple but cut on the body like a promise. She left her blonde hair loose, and the dark cherry lipstick lit up her features in the room's mirror. She went out. Into the night. Arriving in the San Telmo neighborhood, the heart of Argentine tango, her footsteps carried her to a discreet hall, with smoke-filled windows and solid wooden chairs. Tea was called La Rosa del Fuego. The music came from inside like a sensual sigh, and when she stepped inside, everything stopped for a moment, or so it seemed to her. It was one of those moments when life changes direction silently. On stage, 2 old people, but next to the bar stood a man who wasn't dancing, he was just watching her. He seemed to be taken from an old movie. White shirt unbuttoned at the neck, black jacket, slightly wavy hair, black as the night over Buenos Aires. He called her with his eyes, without words. And she came. His name was Alejandro Vargas, a former tango dancer, now an instructor, but also a writer of essays about the sensuality of dance and Argentine identity. His voice was low, but hot as asphalt under the January sun. He asked her if she knew how to dance. She said no. He held out his hand. "Then you've come to the right place." Thus began a dance that would last a lifetime. They danced. They sweated. They melted into each other without words. Alejandro Sanchez's body seemed made to guess his thoughts. Every time Élodie let herself be carried away, she felt the sins of the world being forgiven. That night was the first. Others followed. Her flights began to include unscheduled stops in Buenos Aires. 3 days, then a week. She would temporarily move into his apartment on the 3rd floor, where the curtains were always drawn and the red wine was never missing from the glass. Alejandro never asked too many questions. He knew that this woman came with a burden, but he didn't want to break her from her dream. He just knew that called Élodie, that she flew around the world, that every night she made him forget that there had ever been another woman. She recited poems by Borges to him in bed, showed him the forbidden steps of tango, and told him that her body was the most perfect choreography in Buenos Aires. Élodie felt that she was living a parallel life. That here she was a woman, not a pilot, a lover, not a wife. Maybe even a mother. That's what happened when, one day, she felt that her body was telling her something else. That a life had been conceived. Without telling Alejandro, she went to Paris, took tests. The result was positive. It was the only moment in her life when she stopped. When she closed the cockpit door and stayed at home. But home was not in Paris, where her military husband, Élodie Moreau, was waiting for her. Away on diplomatic fronts in the Middle East, it was neither New York nor Tokyo. Home was in her belly. She gave birth to Isabella in a discreet clinic in Lyon, a girl with black eyes and hair like pitch, who laughed from the first month of life. She left her in the care of an aunt, as she had done with Amélie, promising herself that one day, when she was old, she would gather them all. She returned to Buenos Aires as if nothing had changed. Alejandro received her as on the first night. She never told him that she had a daughter with him. But she loved him in her strange, hidden, consuming way. Once, on a warm February evening, they danced on the roof in the moonlight. Alejandro told her, "You are my impossible tango. If you leave, I will pretend that I never met you. But if you come back, I will forget everything that was and I will dance you again." She smiled. She knew she would leave. But she also knew that she would always come back. It was her curse. Buenos Aires was not just a stopover. It was a sin and a salvation. It was the moment when Élodie understood that she could love with her whole body and still lie with all her conviction. And a secret diary, kept in a hidden compartment in the cockpit, she wrote, "I am not ashamed of being a mother without anyone knowing. I am ashamed of not being able to choose. That I always run away. That I am free, but at the price of the truth." She left Argentina at the end of that year. Not permanently. Buenos Aires became a fixed stopover. But Isabella remained in the shadows, and Alejandro didn't even know he was his father. He just danced. With his body, with his soul, with the hope that the woman from heaven would someday sit on earth for him. And the interview given. Élodie sighs deeply when she reaches this chapter. He looks out the window, as if seeing the cobblestone streets of San Telmo and Alejandro's hypnotic movements. "He once told me that every woman is a dance. I was not a dance, but a storm. And I never told him that Isabella was his child. Maybe because, deep down, I knew that a dance like ours could not be interrupted by reality. It had to remain a fantasy forever." The reporter is silent. He records. He knows that this woman has offered him a rare confession, not about a betrayal, but about a love condemned to concealment. And he knows that other cities are coming. Other men. Other daughters. But Buenos Aires remains the first city where Élodie left a part of herself without ever recovering it. Chapter 7. Under the Savannah Sun. Nairobi. The flight to Nairobi had been a quiet one, with a clear sky that opened like a blue curtain over the vastness of the African continent. The Airbus A330 aircraft that Élodie Moreau piloted with the certainty of a surgeon in a vital operation had touched down in Kenya at 8:37 in the morning. The sun was already burning the reddish earth, and the scent of the savannah mixed with the smell of kerosene and dust. That morning, she did not know that she would meet a love that, although silent and profound, would not tame her. In Nairobi, Élodie was on a 2-day layover. The airline she was flying for, one of the most prestigious in Europe, had scheduled her for a connecting flight Paris-Dubai-Nairobi, with a return in 48 hours. Enough time to enjoy a walk through the city center and perhaps, instinctively, respond the call of her body hungry for emotion. That evening, she was going to a diplomatic dinner organized by the French embassy. Her emerald green dress perfectly hugged the body formed by years of martial arts and shaped by flights around the world. The reception, in a quiet corner, she spotted Kofa Abasai, tall, with ebony skin, eyes as black as the abyss of the Kenyan night, and a deep but calm voice, like the silence between two heartbeats. He wore a simple, unpretentious shirt, but in his gaze there was a nobility of a kind that cannot be taught. He was a humanitarian doctor. He worked for an international organization that treated victims of war and famine in South Sudan and Somalia. The conversation between Élodie and Kofa began politely, but in a few minutes it had become a clash of worlds, an intense exchange of ideas, values, and hidden desires. She was sophisticated, refined, a woman who had created his own mythology among the clouds. He was silent, rooted in the pain and salvation of people. They were so different, but at the same time so attracted to each other, that everything seemed like a bet made by fate. That night, Élodie never returned to her hotel room. She climbed into an old Land Cruiser with Koffer and they got lost in the outskirts of the city, where his modest house was located. No luxury, no symbol of wealth, just wood, canvas and books. There, in the simplicity of that universe, she made love with a tenderness she had rarely felt. It was not the raw passion she had experienced in New York with Jackson or the carnal dance in Buenos Aires. It was an erotic silence, a touch that said, "Stay," even if no voice spoke a word. For 2 days, Élodie was a woman, not a pilot, a woman in all her fullness, seen not as a trophy, but as a soul in search of solace. Koffer had never asked her where she really came from, if she had anyone at home, if she was flying out of passion or flight. Had accepted her presence as a short-lived miracle. But on the morning of her departure, he told her, "If one day you feel that the world doesn't want you up there anymore, come here, I will be there." He didn't promise her anything, he just smiled and kissed her on the forehead. 3 months later, in Paris, after a routine medical checkup, Élodie found out that she was pregnant. For a moment, time stood still. She already had a daughter in America, Amélie, whom she had left in the care of a close family in Quebec, with a forged birth certificate. Now, life was giving her a new daughter, born not out of desire, but out of a peace that she could not forget. The child would be born in Geneva, in the most discreet hospital, private, with documents prepared by Élodie's personal lawyers. No one, not even her husband, Commander Armand Moreau, would suspect anything. She named her daughter Osha, a Swahili name meaning life or hope. She was the only child of 7 to whom Élodie gave a name inspired by the place of her birth and love. Osha grew up in a Swiss boarding school, at the foot of the Jura Mountains, but every month, her mother visited her. Sometimes as a mysterious aunt, sometimes as a simple school friend. None of the teachers imagined that that elegant woman, in a pilot's uniform or Armani suits, was actually the mother of the child with amber eyes. Years later, Osha would resemble perfect with her father. Chocolate complexion, black hair, calm and wise gaze, but with that irrepressible energy inherited from Élodie. She studied medicine, without her mother forcing her in any way. It was as if her parents' blood had already dictated her future. For Élodie, flights to Africa had become more and more frequent. The company assigned her long-haul flights with a stopover in Nairobi or Addis Ababa, and each time, for a day or two, she would sneak into the city like a shadow. She would leave Koffer an envelope, sometimes with a photo of her daughter, sometimes with a simple note, "Osha smiles like you." But they never saw each other again. Their relationship had remained suspended in the memory of a perfect night. Koffer did not know that she had a daughter. Élodie could not tell him. She did it out of a selfishness that she had difficulty admitting. She wanted to destroy that man's balance, to change the course of an already difficult life. And perhaps, deep down, she feared that, knowing, he would have asked her to stay, to give up the sky. It was, of all her loves, the calmest. It didn't ignite her blood like in Havana, it didn't tear her apart like in Tokyo. But it left a mark that was never erased. Sometimes, in the cockpits, watching the sun set over the savannah, she would put her hand on her stomach, where Osha had once grown, and smile. "You are my bright side," she whispered to him in her mind. It was a flight to Africa, it was a 2-night adventure, it was the beginning of a life. And a secret that would float forever among the clouds. Chapter 8. Among the Samurai, Tokyo. Tokyo greeted her with a cold, almost sharp discipline, like a katana blade freshly drawn from its sheath. The clean streets, the silent people, the calculated and orderly movement of the metropolis fascinated her. Here, the world seemed to breathe in precise rhythms, like a mechanical clock, without the dramatic oscillations of the West or the passionate twitches of South America. Everything was in balance. Everything except her heart. Élodie Moreau had arrived in Japan on a night flight from Paris. 3-day stopover, long enough to allow her to visit the city and get lost, for a while, in a place where no one recognized her, where no one asked her where she came from or where she was going. In Tokyo she was invited to an international conference on flight safety, where pilots, engineers, controllers and technicians from all over the world met. There she met Takahiro Watanabe, an aircraft engineer. Quiet and meticulous, Takahiro was a man in his 40s, with a figure sculpted by silence. Black hair, pulled back, thin glasses and a voice so calm that every word sounded like a prayer uttered in a Shinto shrine. Unlike other men who looked at her with desire or fascination, Takahiro looked at her with reverence. Like an apparition. From the first meeting, he had not made a single inappropriate gesture, he had not flirted, he had not complimented unnecessarily, he had only talked about airplanes, about the fine balance between force and grace, about turbulence and trajectories, about fuselages and wings. But in his eyes, Élodie read what words did not say, a silent admiration, a love without beginning and without end, a profound respect that asked for nothing. They spent 2 days together, visiting the temples of Asakusa, walking among the cherry blossoms in Ueno Park, listening to the silence of the torrents in the Nikko Mountains, and a world of silence. Their gestures became language. Fingers touched on a wooden railing, steps synchronized without the need for words, eyes met and stood there, suspended, in the tranquility of an eternal moment. When, on the second evening, Takahiro invited her to his apartment in Shibuya, Élodie did not hesitate. It was not desire that she felt, it was not curiosity, it was the need to be looked at without being possessed. And Takahiro did nothing but offer her what no other man had offered her before, an altar. Her body had been desired by many, he had been burned by passion, ravaged by violent loves, conquered by fantasies. But never, until then, had he been seated, with slow gestures, in a sacred space. Takahiro had undressed her without haste, touching her with his fingers as if she were a piece of Edo period porcelain, with a delicacy that had overwhelmed her. The love he offered her was a ritual without moans, without force, without selfishness. Just a total, quiet dedication. After that night, Élodie stayed with him for another day. They did not talk about the future, they did not promise anything. Takahiro, in his Japanese way, did not ask for explanations, he did not ask if she was married or if she had children. He understood that this woman, who came and went like a comet, could not be tied to the earth of any man. When you fly over Japan again, look at Mount Fuji, I will be there, he told her. And Élodie smiled, knowing that it was a kind of eternal separation. But life, as always, would continue its game. A few months later, in a discreet hospital in Lausanne, Élodie gave birth to a little girl. Her name was Naomi, a name that in Hebrew means pleasure or beauty, but which in the language Japanese can be translated as beautiful justice. Naomi had oriental features, almond eyes, fine black hair, porcelain skin. She was the image of her father, a living mirror of a man who lived in a country thousands of kilometers away and who probably did not know that, at that moment, he had become a father. As with the other children, Élodie chose discretion. Naomi was raised by a close adoptive family, and the documents were carefully drawn up and no clue to the true identity of her parents. Only a will hidden in a bank safe, with a letter written by Élodie. If one day you feel that you were loved before you were born, know that it is true. Your father looked at me like a goddess. And you were the gift of that look. Naomi grew up in Switzerland, but at the age of 12 she began to study the language Japanese, without anyone asking her. She felt an inexplicable call, an attraction to haiku, to the tea ceremony, to the art of bonsai and calligraphy. Tea was as if the blood in her veins preserved the memory of ancient gestures. For Élodie, Naomi was the daughter who kept meaning. Not the most beloved, not the closest, but the purest. In her eyes, her mother found in Takahiro's gaze that tranquility that had made her feel worthy of worship, not possession. Years passed, and Élodie carefully avoided any flight that would take her to Tokyo again. She felt that if she stepped foot there again, she would disturb the balance of a story that had to remain perfect, unaltered by time or explanation. Instead, every November 5, the day she met Takahiro, she retreated to a small house in Brittany and lit a candle in front of a wooden statues representing a geisha. Tea was her ritual. Sometimes, among the clouds of an altitude of 10,000 meters, looking out the porthole in the cockpit, Élodie imagined that, somewhere, Takahiro was looking up at the sky. Maybe from a Zen garden, maybe from an airplane hangar. And maybe, without knowing why, she felt a warm tear rising to her eyelids, an emotion without a name. But in that invisible space between heaven and earth, two souls were touching. Again. Through Naomi. Chapter 9. Under the Southern Stars. Sydney. When the Air France plane touched down on the Sydney runway on a hot January afternoon, Élodie Moreau had no idea she was entering a new chapter in the saga of her mysterious life. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, Like a mirror stretched out over a land pulsating with life, she stepped out of the cabin, breathing in the salty sea air. She felt something strange, a peace she hadn't known in a long time. Australia was not just a destination on her world itinerary, it was to become a refuge, a secret parenthesis full of love. The Paris-Singapore-Sydney flight had been a long but uplifting one, a pilot in command. Élodie seemed to have stepped out of a dream advertisement. Her uniform outlined her athletic body, impeccably maintained through years of discipline and passion for martial arts. Her blonde hair, tightly in a perfect bun, and her piercing blue eyes attracted attention in any VIP reception room. But beyond the image, the woman carried within her an unquenchable lust for life, for touch, for adrenaline and mystery. During her days off in Sydney, Élodie had decided to stay a few nights by the ocean, in a chic hotel in Bondi Beach Point. One evening, on the terrace of the Ocean's Whisper restaurant, she heard Liam Hunter's voice for the first time. The story of coral reefs and the giants of the ocean, and he had a way of speaking that made her forget everything that was logical or prudent. Liam was not the type that Élodie would have usually noticed. He had wild hair, suntanned skin, and his hands bore the marks of field work. A marine biologist, he spent weeks lost in the open Pacific, documenting the lives of whales and the behavior of dolphins. He was her opposite, far from the lights of the city, of the hustle and bustle of airports, of life calculated in minutes and air miles. But it was precisely this difference that ignited an uncontrollable chemistry between them on a starry night. On the rocky shore near Watson's Bay, they made love under the southern sky. Tea had been neither planned nor rushed, just inevitable. Liam had looked at her as if he saw in her not only physical beauty, but also that inner fire that no one had ever managed to extinguish. And this time, for the first time, Élodie had not only felt wanted, she had felt understood. Not judged. Not analyzed. Not suspected. The time spent with Liam became a dream suspended between two flights. Every month, Élodie arranged for Sydney to appear in her rotation of destinations. They would see each other secretly, living each moment intensely, dives in blue depths, campfires on deserted beaches, impromptu dinners with freshly caught fish, and her arms to him. Élodie was someone else, carefree woman, without a double identity, without the baggage of a hidden life. But destiny, always accompanied by consequences, would bring a new miracle. She felt the change in her body from the first weeks. It had happened again. The fourth daughter was in the making, the seed of a forbidden but pure love. She kept the secret with the same strategic coolness with which she maneuvered planes through storms. Liam never found out that his daughter was born in a discreet clinic in Marseille and was christened Isla, as a tribute to the southern islands, full of peace. Isla inherited her father's eyes and her mother's hair. From the very first years, she was instinctively drawn to water. She swam with unexpected grace and spent hours playing in the waves of the sea. Élodie, mother for the fourth time, felt with each child a unique imprint, an echo of her lovers scattered around the world. Each daughter was a story, and Isla was the chapter from which her soul began to yearn for another life, quieter, perhaps even settled. But peace was not a path that Élodie could walk too far. Much. Her duty as a wife called her back to Paris. Armand Moreau, her husband, a decorated officer in the French army, was the respectable, rigid man, the model of a generation who never asked what he didn't want to know. He loved his wife, but he loved her in the shadows. With a dose of silent possessiveness, he suspected nothing of her passionate wanderings. He believed that his woman lived for her career, for flying, for the prestige of being one of the most admired women in European civil aviation. Liam didn't know either. He continued to live among the waves, writing about whale migration and hoping that one day, Élodie would leave her career behind and immerse herself in his aquatic world. But she always left. With a smile, with whispered promises, with warm gestures, but never with commitments. He couldn't give her more, or he didn't want to. Years passed. Isla, she grew up, and without knowing where she came from, she always wanted to study marine biology. When she came of age, Élodie watched her leave for Australia, just as she herself had left, a lifetime before. She never told her the truth. Neither to her daughter nor to her father. The loves had remained sealed chapters, and Élodie flew on, between continents, between desires and secrets, between love and freedom. But in her heart, Sydney had a different weight. It was not just a city on the map, but a silent wound, an unfinished dream. Every time she flew over the Australian coast, Élodie closed her eyes and felt again the warm sand of the beach, Liam's breath on the back of her neck and the rapid beating of her heart. She had almost stayed there. But she couldn't. Because a lifetime of loves also means a lifetime of running away. Chapter 10. The Art of Seduction, Rome. Rome. The eternal city, where every broken column, every ancient ruin and every cobblestone alley preserves a story, a fantasy, an illusion of the past that does not want to die. For Élodie Moreau, Rome was not just a tourist destination or a stopover on the map of international flights. It was perhaps more than any other city the space of an inner metamorphosis, the place where seduction became art, and love a wound painted in fine oils, smelling of turpentine and desire. It was the beginning of autumn. And Rome wore its melancholy with elegance. The leaves of the plane trees fell silently over the streets of Trastevere, and the light was soft, yellow, like in a Flemish painting. Élodie, who had arrived on a backup mission aboard an Airbus A320, had taken a few days off to stay in the city. She felt the need for a break, but not of the body, but of the soul. The last few years had been a spiral of hidden passions, silent confessions and secret births. Rome attracted her like an old, dusty, but still sacred icon on Via Margutta, a hidden street of artists. She almost unintentionally entered a restoration workshop. She had been drawn by a discreet melody, Vivaldi, and the smell of wood, paint and old canvas. There, in the penumbra of that artistic sanctuary, she saw Marco Bellini for the first time. Marco was not a handsome man in the classical sense. He had rough features, a nose slightly broken from a teenage accident and an unkempt beard, but his eyes, of an intense, restless green, they had fixed their gaze. With an almost painful intensity, he was an art restorer, a specialist in Renaissance frescoes and tempera paintings. His hands touched the surfaces as if they were living skins, and in that touch there was a science, but also a consuming passion. Élodie wanted to leave, but he asked her if she wanted to drink an espresso. She couldn't refuse. Between them, the silence began to take on meaning. They didn't need many words. He simply told her that he wanted to paint her, that it had not happened to him for a long time to see a woman with light on her face. She laughed, used to hearing seductive lines in all the languages of the world. But there was nothing superficial in his voice. It was a call. Whole days followed in which Élodie posed for him. Naked, covered only by a silk shawl, on an old divan, among the smells of melted wax and dried roses. Marco worked in silence, concentrated, but sometimes he would come closer and whisper ideas to her about beauty, about imperfection, about how her face carried a silent suffering that needed to be captured. For the first time, Élodie felt vulnerable. Not because she was naked, but because she was seen. Not as a pilot, not as a desired woman, but as a living museum of an art in agony. Story was born between them. It was strange. It was not romantic love, nor frenetic passion. It was a duel, a slow hunt between two intense natures. Marco had a complicated past, an ex-wife who had left him for another painter, and a reputation in artistic Rome as an impossible, capricious, withdrawn man. But with Élodie, his mask fell. Every night spent together was a ritual of seduction and exploration. They did not talk about the future, nor about the past, only about the body, art, and sensations. And yet, Élodie felt that the city was pulling her down, that she loved Marco more than she could admit. Rome was not like Buenos Aires or Sydney. It was not exotic. It was visceral, almost mystical. It made her ask herself questions about identity, about purpose, about femininity. In the streets of the city, walking alone at night, she remembered Bernini, Caravaggio, the faces of Madonnas and martyrs, and in all of them she found something of herself. Few weeks after leaving Rome, she found out she was pregnant. She didn't hesitate to carry the pregnancy to term. She never told Marco. She understood that such news would have destroyed her fragile balance. He was not made to be a father. He was born to create, to restore, to burn in his own torment. She gave birth to Chiara in a discreet clinic in Tuscany, and the name was chosen to reflect what she had felt in Rome, painful clarity. Chiara, clear as the morning light, clear as the unspoken truth. Chiara grew up among color palettes, sketchbooks and classical music lessons. She was the dreamiest of Élodie's daughters. Since childhood, she wanted to become a restorer of old churches. She had fantastic patience and a precise hand, and no one knew where this calling came from, but Élodie did. Marco's blood lived in her. Years later, Élodie returned to Rome on a business visit, and a small gallery near Piazza Navona. She saw a painting, the portrait of a naked woman, covered only by a red veil, with closed eyes and a barely perceptible smile on the frame, in discreet letters. It was written, La donna che non torno mait was her face, and in the lower right corner, the signature, Bellini. Her heart sank. Marco had painted her, he hadn't forgotten her, he hadn't even tried. But Élodie didn't enter the gallery. She looked at the painting for a while, then left. Some loves cannot be resumed. They are works of art. They end when the artist's hand stops. And they remain like that, whole in their imperfection. Without explanations. Without conclusions. Rome was more than a stopover in Élodie's life. It was a lesson in seduction and renunciation, about how beauty can be dangerous when it falls in love with another form of itself. With Marco Bellini, she experienced a love that did not burn, but slowly sculpted it, like a marble scalpel. And from that love Chiara was born, the light of an art that never dies. Chapter 11. Under the Desert Moon. Casablanca. It was a warm June night when Élodie's plane descended smoothly over the vibrant lights of Casablanca. The dark blue Moroccan sky seemed covered with a velvet cloth sprinkled with stars. Beneath her, the African continent pulsed to the rhythm of her own heartbeat, and Élodie Moreau, then a 37-year-old woman, felt that, for the first time in her life, her steps were taking her not to an adventure but to an initiation. Her flight was part of a diplomatic mission. She was transporting French officials to an economic conference in Rabat, but she had chosen to stay one night in Casablanca. Checked into a hotel overlooking the ocean, she felt the salty warm air touch her skin like a familiar caress. The woman in her, always in search of a new emotion, was drawn to the mysterious energy of the city, a mixture of tradition, poetry and resistance. That's how she met Youssef Ben Mahdi. Youssef was not the kind of man you would notice in a crowd. He had a discreet presence, but a voice that seemed to come from another era. To professor of literature at Hassan II University and a writer banned by the regime, he carried with him an aura of danger wrapped in verse. They had met in a small bookstore in the Habas neighborhood. Élodie was leafing through a rare volume of Arabic poetry translated into French. He paid her a simple but profound compliment. Poetry needs no translation when it is read by eyes like yours. And from that love Chiara was born, the light of an art that never dies. It was the beginning of a relationship that was unlike any other in her life. Youssef did not want her for her body, at least not at first. He wanted to know her, to understand her shadows, to make her tell her secrets herself. He challenged her to ask herself questions. And for Élodie, who had always lived on the run, under the adrenaline of takeoffs and hidden desires, meeting a man who did not run after her, but waited for her, was a revelation. They began to meet in hidden cafes, on the roofs of Casbah's, in gardens hidden by jasmine. He read her verses by Mahmoud Darwish and Rumi. She told her about skies crossed and continents conquered. They never spoke of the future. Their relationship lived in the intense present of every night. One evening, against the backdrop of a traditional song, Youssef told her, "If you were a poem, no one would dare to translate it." She laughed, but deep down in her soul, those words opened an old wound, the desire to be understood beyond the beautiful body, beyond the pilot's uniform, beyond the mask of the invincible woman in Casablanca. Élodie, she felt vulnerable for the first time. And it was in that vulnerability that Layla was born. She hadn't planned anything. She had told Youssef she was going back to France for a few weeks, but in reality she was flying to Tokyo on another mission. She felt she couldn't tell him the truth. She had lied to him, just as she had lied to everyone else. But when she found out she was pregnant, tears flowed uncontrollably for the first time. Not out of shame. Not out of fear. But because she knew that the child could not live in a lie. She wanted to tell Youssef, but the regime was becoming increasingly oppressive, and he was being pursued by the political police. She chose to protect him by absence. Layla was born in a discreet clinic in the south of Spain. She was a child with large eyes, olive skin and wavy hair, a hypnotic combination of desert and sky. Élodie hired a Moroccan family in Marseille to raise her, promising to take care of her education and future. She visited them secretly, sending them letters, money and toys. Layla grew up with a restless curiosity, with an intelligence that reminded Élodie of her lost father. Meanwhile, Élodie's life returned to the deceptive routine of flights, luxury hotels, secret missions and a marriage in which silence was an unwritten pact. Her husband, Armand Moreau, an officer in the Foreign Legion, was often away on military operations. They met rarely, they loved each other superficially, But they kept up appearances. It was a union between two people who no longer asked anything of each other, each hiding their own guilt under the armor of honor. But Morocco never left her. She often flew over the desert and felt her heart tighten. One night, at an altitude of over 10,000 meters, looking at the full moon above the red sands, Élodie murmured, "Je t'aime, Youssef." The co-pilot did not understand the context. He smiled, thinking it was a novel or a poem thrown into the wind. But for Élodie, it was a silent farewell. Years later, when Layla turned 18, Élodie revealed the truth. She told him about her father, about Casablanca, about the verses that had tamed a woman who thought she could no longer be touched by love. Layla cried. Not from pain, but from gratitude. She promised herself that she would go to Casablanca to look for traces of Youssef, even if she did not know if he was still alive. For Élodie, Layla was the unspoken poetry. She was the legacy of a love that had no time, but had depth, a love that was not lived to the end, but that burned silently for a lifetime. And in the interview that, at 79 years old, she gave to the journalist Caroline Delacour in her Paris apartment, Élodie closed her eyes for a moment, recalling that night in Casablanca. "Under the desert moon," she said with a melancholic smile, "I learned that poetry can be lived, even if it cannot be spoken to the end." Caroline, who listened attentively, noted every word. But in her gaze there was more than journalistic curiosity. It was the fascination of a young woman who was meeting, perhaps for the first time, a woman who had never been afraid to love, to make mistakes, to live beyond limits. And Élodie, old beautiful, with the same icy eyes and her hair tied in an elegant bun, raised her teacup and concluded, "Each of my children is a poem born from a continent. But Layla is the poem that I did not have the courage to write out loud." Chapter 12. The Unseen Girls. The sky was the only constant in Élodie Moreau's life. In every cloud, in every sunrise seen from the cockpit, she hid a thought, a fear, a forbidden love and an unspoken promise. But her greatest secrets were not in the sky, but on earth, in 7 corners of the world, in the arms of 7 fathers who did not know that they shared the same woman, nor even that their little girls shared the same blood. After each love, after each birth, Élodie made a painful but precise decision. The children had to be left there, safe, away from suspicion, scandals, and especially from Armand, her husband, the French officer who loved her, but who would never forgive the truth. It had not been a pre-established plan. She had not initially wanted to have children. But life had its way of infiltrating the decisions of a woman who believed her heart was invincible. Each daughter was a surprise, a small and trembling miracle, born in a world of elegant lies and evasive flights. The first had been Amélie, Jackson's child from New York. Élodie had said that she was an orphan girl to whom he had become attached during a humanitarian mission, and, miraculously, Jackson had agreed to raise her without question. "You are an angel," he had told her, and Élodie had smiled sadly, knowing that the truth was exactly the opposite. She was a sin with wings. And Buenos Aires, Isabella was born, the girl of dance and hot nights. Alejandro received her with trembling arms, not understanding how such a short love could bring life. Élodie had invented a story about abandonment, about a teenage mother who did not want the child. Alejandro had believed her and did not ask her for any further explanations. She nurtured her daughter with the same passion with which she had once danced with Élodie under the moonlight, on the banks of the Silver River. Asha, Kenya's daughter, lived in the hut by the savannah, growing up among sun-weary lions and the sweet bees of the baobabs. Kofa considered her a divine gift. He often told Élodie that God had sent a little girl to relieve his suffering in the crowded hospitals of Africa. He never suspected that that child had the blood of a pilot and the face of her mother in a smile. In Tokyo. When Naomi was born, Élodie was caught in a much deeper moral dilemma. Takahiro, meticulous and attentive, felt that something was wrong. He could not accept the idea of a spontaneous adoption, nor of an unknown mother, so Élodie told him a part of the truth. That Naomi was the child of a close friend who had died in a plane crash, and that she could not bear the thought of leaving the girl alone in the world. Takahiro, noble in his sadness, received her with respect and silence. He thanked Élodie for entrusting him with a life. Isla, the girl of the waters of Sydney, grew up among dolphins and corals, in the care of Liam, who saw in her a magical little girl. He was not interested in the details of the past. Élodie had appeared, brought him a child, then disappeared again, like a mermaid. She sent him rare but profound letters, and Liam kept them all in a rusty metal box, next to the first strand of the little girl's hair in Rome. Marco had grown up with the conviction that Chiara was the fruit of a tragic love. Élodie had never appeared again after her birth, leaving him a calligraphic letter in which she told him that her destiny was tied to heaven, not to earth, but that she asked him to raise the little girl as a work of art. Marco painted her every day. Chiara was his living muse, and in every brushstroke, in every shade of blue in her eyes, one could see the missing mother. The last daughter, Layla, lived in Casablanca, among Yusef's poems and the cries of the hot streets. The little girl had inherited the melancholy of the desert and the unseen strength of Élodie. Yusef, although he loved her, knew that this woman had come from another world, perhaps from another man's dream, but he had not asked anything, he had accepted. The girl as a silent covenant. Élodie juggled with almost mathematical meticulousness between flights, between continents, between lives. Her agenda was a secret network of data, codes and motives. She flew with Air France, but in reality, she flew between hearts. For each child she had a hidden birthday, an invented story and a quick visit. Camouflaged between the stopover and departure, he knew that the girls would grow up and that a day would come when the questions would become more than the answers. But he relied on the fact that each lived in a completely different world, raised by a devoted father and without connections between them. The internet was dangerous, but it had not yet completely overcome distances and fragmented identities. Armand, her husband, was the only one completely blind. He loved her with an almost heroic devotion, but he was away often on military missions, and when he returned, he was content with the warm embraces of a perfect wife, without suspecting anything. Élodie played her role with a mastery acquired in years of flying. She changed her smile like others changed their uniforms. But the truth was beginning to erode her. With each stopover, with each curious look from a daughter, with each question she could not answer, Élodie felt the weight of the lie like a seat belt that was too tight. The invincible woman, the seductress with ice eyes, had begun to vibrate at the thought that one day, her 7 treasures might meet. What would she say then? Who would forgive? Who would understand? But for now, she kept the mystery. She continued her flights, planned her visits, practiced her lies with elegance. Her girls were invisible to each other, but in her heart, there was always a sky with 7 stars, each illuminating a corner of the life of a woman who loved too much and said too little. And maybe one day, she would gather them all. Maybe one day, the sky would hide nothing anymore. Chapter 13. 7 Continents of the Heart. The morning air was pouring in through the wide-open windows of the villa in Normandy, where Élodie Moreau, at the age of 79, was preparing to continue the interview she had begun with a young journalist. On the lacquered wooden coffee table stood 7 photographs lined up. 7 faces, 7 girls, 7 continents of her heart, with her fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness but from the thrill of emotion. Élodie touched them one by one, like a conductor preparing her orchestra for the symphony of memory. Every man I have loved, and no, I am not ashamed to say loved, was a gateway to a part of me. Not just physically, but also spiritually, mentally, erotically, viscerally, she said, looking the journalist in the eye. It was hard to imagine a woman who, in a life full of flights, landings and stopovers, had not only an impeccable career as an airline pilot, but also a parallel life in which each love had become a red thread that guided her through continents, desires and contradictions. Jackson Carter, New York, North America. Jackson was the first, a writer, bohemian, wild and brilliant at the same time. He was the flame of my youth, the man who made me daydream in a Brooklyn cafe. He spoke about literature as if the world had stopped to listen to him. Amélie was the fruit of that beautiful madness. With him I felt what it meant to be seen, not just as a woman, but as a force. He loved me with everything I was, but I could never make him understand that I could not stand still. For Élodie, Jackson represented the beginning, the continent of self-knowledge and impatient desire. America had been for her the promise, the energy, the impulse. Alejandro Sánchez Buenos Aires, South America. Alejandro Sánchez was a famous dancer and choreographer from Buenos Aires, with eyes like ebony and movements like a feline in the night. And South America, passion is religion, and Alejandro was the priest of tango. When Élodie Moreau stepped into his dance hall, the music of the world stopped. Between their steps, bodies came dangerously close, and souls clashed in silence. She sought escape, he, a muse. Under the pale lights of the San Telmo neighborhood, a passionate, wild, and impossible love was born. From their love came Isabella, a wonderful child who had the talent of her father and the beauty of her mother. Kofa Abasai, Nairobi, Africa. With Kofa in Kenya, everything was quiet, a humanitarian doctor who saved lives with his hands, without asking for anything in return. His body spoke in silence, in slow and warm breaths. I was, for the first time, seated within myself. But not even his gentleness could calm the volcano that was smoldering within me. With him, I understood what balance means. Osha, our daughter, has the nobility of his gaze. Africa had become the continent of warm hearts, of reconciliation, of a love that did not demand, but gave daughter maternal love, almost sacred. Takahiro Watanabe, Tokyo, Asia. Takahiro was something else, another dimension. His touches were not carnal, but ritualistic. Everything was silence, gesture, respect. He always looked at me like a goddess, without putting me on a false pedestal, but in the depths of his soul. With him I knew slow, almost philosophical love. Naomi is the silence that says it all. Asia meant for Élodie the continent of inner discipline and refinement. Tea was a meditated love, contained between haikus and tea ceremonies, but at the same time deeply sensual, hidden under the folds of a culture that adores mystery. Liam Hunter, Sydney, Australia. Liam was fire in the waves, a marine biologist, with a brilliant mind and a suntan body. We made love on the beach, in the water, in log cabins, at dawn and dusk. His gentle wildness made me forget for a while that I had a double life. With him, nature became a witness to everything. Isla, our daughter, has his laugh, a laugh that makes the seas vibrate. Australia was the continent of unchaining. There, Élodie had felt part of the elements. Wind, water, sand, salt. Their love had no sophisticated words, just gestures, breaths, instinct. Marco Bellini, Rome, Europe. Marco was the love that burns slowly, an art restorer who told me one day that my blonde hair was a brush of light on the canvas of his life. He was dangerous, obsessive, artistic. But with him I felt like a muse. Not the woman who pilots Boeings, but the goddess who inspires. Chiara is his embodied sensitivity, a dreamer. Europe, the native continent, had been for Élodie the space of classical passion, of tragic beauty, of love full of aesthetics. Rome did not offer her rest, but fever. Youssef Ben Modi, Casablanca, North Africa. Youssef was poetry. He spoke to me in verses. He wrote on my skin with the fingers of a revolutionary and a poet. Casablanca was a mirage, but a real one. We loved each other in a world where any touch could become danger. Layla is the dream born of a sweet chaos. Morocco was clandestine love, a love lived on the run, in the shadows of white walls and under the lights of bronze lanterns, a scent of jasmine and rebellion. And yet, my husband, and Armand Moreau. My husband, French officer. Loyal, sober, clean. With him I had a linear life. We traveled together only a few times. Then I started telling him that my flights kept me away. He never asked too much. Maybe he knew. Maybe he didn't want to know. It was the love of convention, of safety, of decorum. But it was never complete love. Henri was the continent of silence, of what is not said, not shown, a necessary background for the vibrant picture of Élodie's life. 7 continents, 7 men, 7 girls. Each child carries something of that love, a look, a gesture, an idea. And each of them is a window to a world that I touched not only with the plane, but with my heart, with my body, with my madness. The reporter wrote frantically, amazed by the sincerity and clarity of this woman who, beyond the mysteries of a double life, seemed not to regret nothing. Would I do it all over again? The journalist asked. Without hesitation, Élodie replied. Because, you see, the sky is not just for the pilot, it is also for the heart. And I flew not only between continents, I flew between men, between loves, between forms of life. I was alive, completely alive. And for the first time in the interview, Élodie smiled not just with her lips, but with her entire history, smile that united all the continents of the heart in one immense confession. Chapter 14. The Lie Stopwatch. For Élodie Moreau, life was not a simple succession of days. It was a complex clockwork, a precision mechanism built of alibis, carefully planned flights, hidden letters, encrypted applications and exact times in different time zones. No Swiss watchmaker could have matched her rigor, and a world where a single mistake could mean the collapse of the entire edifice of secrecy. Élodie lived with seconds counted, her breath caught between two meetings, between two continents, between two versions of her own identity. She had two diaries, one physical, old, with leather covers, in which she noted only the official routes, the flights Paris, Dubai, Singapore, Toronto, New York, Bucharest. This one could be found by anyone. The other was digital, encrypted with a system that only she and her former Japanese lover, Takahiro Watanabe, they could understand him and that diary. Every initial, every number corresponded to a secret meeting, a child, a birthday. LMH 13/09BNE was not just a code. It was the meeting with Liam Hunter in Brisbane, on the occasion of Isla's birthday. Élodie had learned over the years that you can't keep 7 loves alive without absolute control of every detail. She flew 3 times a week, and the rest of the time she disappeared for psychological checkups, for recovery, for special missions or fictitious training. Sometimes, she justified her absences by technical errors in the planes, sometimes by family needs in the south of France. Her husband, Colonel Armand Moreau, a devoted man but extremely busy with operations in conflict zones, had no time to suspect anything. When she returned home, Élodie was there. Warm, devoted, sensual, impeccable, it seemed impossible, but Élodie had learned the art of dissociation. Each man lived in a different drawer of her heart. Each city had its own scent, taste and music. Buenos Aires vibrated in the tango of bodies with Alejandro. Casablanca was a nocturnal poetry with Youssef. Tokyo was tranquility, ritual and respect. Sydney meant wilderness and freedom. Rome brought refinement and risks. Nairobi was the calm under which desire smoldered. And New York was the first, the beginning of madness. In airports, Élodie had become a chameleon. She changed her perfume, her nail color, her hairstyle, even her accent. And at a terminal in Dubai she spoke fluent Arabic. In Paris she seemed like an elegant Frenchwoman. In Toronto she played the role of a cold and professional pilot. And in Rome she seemed like a muse detached from a Renaissance painting. She was hard to catch. None of the men had any connections with each other. Each lived in his own bubble of truth and passion. To avoid overlapping data, Élodie used an airline scheduling application that gave her visibility over the next 6 months. She always had 3 alternatives for each route. If, for some reason, a flight was cancelled or a man changed his plans, she could change the itinerary in seconds. She had friends who were air traffic controllers, flight attendants, and fellow pilots who, without knowing exactly what she was covering up, helped her keep up appearances. Each child born was secretly registered with the father's name. In the eyes of the world, Élodie had no children. But behind the curtain, she visited her daughters every year, in a secret ritual. She would bring them a doll that looked like her, a miniature airplane, a book written in French. She would not tell them who she really was. She would only say, "I am a friend of your mother. She loves you very much." But each of them, as they grew older, had begun to feel the unspoken connection. Blue eyes, laughter, walking, the voice. Élodie was aware that one day, the lies would come dangerously close to each other. But she lived every moment like a dance over an abyss. She was, as Takahiro called her, an umbrella woman. She seemed light, fragile, but she hid a metal structure of military precision. Flying was the only place where she could be herself. In the cabin of the plane, surrounded by sky and clouds, she lost the weight of her lies. She was free, the supreme commander of her own life. But even the best don't always escape. Once, an email was almost sent by mistake to Marco Bellini instead of Jackson Carter. Another time, Liam's daughter, Isla, told her father that a woman who looked like her mother had come to visit again. Liam raised an eyebrow, but he blamed it on some distant relative. Each time, Élodie managed to put out the fire. But she felt that time was beginning to tighten, like a rope around a story that was becoming too big to be kept secret. The days she flew from Nairobi to Tokyo, then to Casablanca and back to Paris had become increasingly exhausting. Her body remained young, disciplined, toned, well-nourished. But her soul was beginning to tire. Sometimes, looking out the plane window at the infinite blue, she wondered if she wasn't a prisoner in her own web. Maybe it was time to tell the truth, or maybe She could still dance among the invisible threads of her life, prolonging this show with the elegance of a master. Only one thing reassured her. She knew that all 7 girls were fine. They had grown up with good fathers. Each one loved that child with a sincerity that made Élodie cry silently, in hotel rooms, in cockpits, in airplanes 10,000 meters above the ground. She may not have been a classic mother, but she had loved each one and each child individually, with a discretion that had become part of her DNA. The stopwatch kept ticking in Élodie's heart. Every second was an echo of a choice, a difficult choice, but never regretted, and that fragile balance between heaven and sin, between love and deception, between passion and silence. Élodie had become the supreme maestro of a life built on desire and perfectly synchronized lies. Chapter 15. The Husband Who Didn't Know. Colonel Élodie Moreau was, in every way, a man of honor. Raised in the strict discipline of a military family in Brittany, his life had been built on simple values: duty, truth, devotion to his homeland and family. He had a dignified presence, a calm voice and a deep gaze, capable of reading a man's intentions just from the way he held his hands or avoided his gaze. But, despite this, Armand had never been able to fully read the woman he had married. Élodie had been a revelation to him, a porcelain beauty, with a subtle intelligence and a discreet charm. From the very beginning, she had conquered him not by her brilliance, but by her mysterious silence. She always had a smile that seemed to hide an entire world, and she rarely spoke about herself. Armand, in his romantic naivety, had interpreted that mystery as a form of inner nobility. Maybe it really was, or maybe it was the beginning of an illusion that she would keep for the rest of her life. Their marriage was never passionate, but it was, strangely, stable. Armand often went on missions, to theaters of operations in Africa, the Middle East or the Balkans. Their time together was measured in short vacations, occasional dinners and messages sent at odd hours. In those rare moments of intimacy, Élodie was warm, attentive, gentle. He listened to him, put his hand on his chest and told him how much he admired him for his courage. Armand, tired and hungry for peace, felt loved. And he didn't suspect anything. He was, perhaps, too honest to suspect betrayal. Had an almost childish trust in the oath he had sworn at the altar. For him, fidelity was non-negotiable. It was a matter of character. So, on the rare occasions when Élodie disappeared for international symposia, aviation courses, or medical rehab, Armand didn't ask questions. He accepted. In his mind, it was his own fault. The prolonged absences, the desire to build a career, the inability to offer her more. So, when he saw her beaming upon her return, impeccably dressed, her eyes sparkling in the light, he was content with that fragment of presence. In reality, there was a distance of silence. They didn't argue. They didn't raise their voices. But they didn't say everything either. Armand felt, from time to time, a vague coldness, a discreet withdrawal from Élodie, especially after certain departures. Once, when he asked her if everything was okay, she smiled at him and said only, "Just tired. Sometimes. The sky is heavier than the earth." Armand agreed and brought him a cup of tea. He didn't insist. In his mind, it was normal for a female pilot to experience moments of melancholy. And maybe it was true, or maybe it was the beginning of another journey that he would never know. The love between them had never been scandalous. They didn't kiss in the streets, they didn't write passionate letters to each other. But there was a kind of tender loyalty there, an unspoken care. Armand remembered how Élodie ironed his uniforms, how she placed his beret on the mirror, how he left short notes in her breast pocket, with simple messages: "Take care of yourself. I'll be back soon. I'm thinking about you." These small gestures kept him connected to her. He didn't need more. And yet, if he had been more attentive, he would have noticed certain discrepancies. Sometimes, the date on the plane ticket he happened to see didn't correspond to Élodie's story. Other times, her perfume changed from one week to the next, as if she were building a different identity, or the prolonged silence, sometimes an entire day, without a clear explanation. But Armand rejected his suspicions. Not because he was naive, but because he loved her. And love, in its purest form, prefers to believe, not accuse. Those around them saw them as an elite couple. He, a respected, decorated officer, in control of himself. She, a refined, discreet, elegant career woman. They were invited to official dinners, to ambassadorial receptions, to wedding ceremonies. Armand held her arm with a restrained pride, And Élodie smiled at her like an anchor. Maybe in those moments, everything was real. Maybe they both played their roles so precisely that the lie had become, for a moment, the truth. But in Élodie's soul another battle was being fought. For her, Armand had been the only man she had loved with a serene love. Not a passionate love, not a consuming love, but a form of loyal affection, in which she found a part of her lost childhood. Armand had offered her stability, trust, respect. He had been the man who had treated her as a whole, not as an enigma. That's why Élodie hadn't lied to him out of contempt, but out of helplessness. She had been caught in a merry-go-round that she no longer knew how to stop, and Armand had become, without his will, the fixed reference point in a universe in constant motion. One night, after returning from Tokyo, Élodie woke up and watched him sleep. His silence, the peace on his face buried in the white cotton pillow, broke her heart. She thought about how much she was hurting him without wanting to, and yet, she couldn't give up the other side of her life. She lived between two worlds, one of light, built with Armand, and one of shadow, in which love had become a network of desires and secret followers. Armand didn't know, or he preferred not to know. Until the last moment, he remained the same, calm, balanced, discreet. Even when, years later, Élodie began to become quieter, more tired, more truly absent, he did not ask. He held her in his arms and said only, "I love you as you are. You never owed me anything." That phrase was perhaps the most painful form of forgiveness. Because behind it, Élodie understood, he knew, or at least he suspected. But he had chosen to love her more than the truth. Their marriage was, in the end, an unfinished work of art, a fresco in which one side was painted in warm colors, and the other in shades of gray, a dance of appearances, yes, but also a testament to a deeper truth. That sometimes, love is not about possession, but patience. Is not about questions, but presence. And that sometimes, spouses who don't know, are the ones who love most sincerely. Chapter 16. The Pilot's Code. In a world of commercial aviation dominated by men, Élodie Moreau was a shining anomaly. Not just because she was a woman, but because she was impeccable. She was perfect in her uniform, with her precise haircut, her pilot's glasses always clean, her firm steps in international terminals. She had that aura of professional intransigence that made younger pilots instantly stand up when she entered the room. Everyone called her Commander Moreau, even outside the cockpit. For Élodie, the airplane cabin was her sanctuary. There was no desire, no lies, no past. Only the dashboard, the voice of the air traffic controller, the technical parameters, the flight itself. It was the only place where silence made sense and where her brilliant mind felt at home. And the sky, she was invincible. The earth was fragile, complicated, dangerous. But the sky belonged to her. When she first climbed into a cockpit, she was only 22 years old, but her blue eyes burned with determination. The instructors said of her that she did not blink even when the engine gave out in the simulation. She had a cold, almost military lucidity, perhaps influenced by her marriage to Armand Moreau, the colonel who had taught her what discipline meant. But Élodie had her own code. She called it the Pilot's Code, and it was not written in manuals or imposed by regulations. It was a set of principles that made her different. For her, a good pilot was not just a flight technician, but a commander of her own world. Order, control, passenger safety, loyalty to the crew, all mattered. But above all, the appearance of perfection. No one should see any chinks in her armor. The crews respected her, but they also feared her. When she went to briefings, all the flight attendants hurried over, with their documents in order. Any procedural error was penalized. She did not shout, she did not insult, but her cold silence could freeze even a plane on runway. A flight attendant was once 4 minutes late for boarding. Without a word, Élodie handed him a letter of disciplinary report that had already been drafted. When his colleagues asked him how Commander Moreau had reacted, he replied simply. He smiled, "That's it. And I knew my job was lost." During the long flights, Paris, Johannesburg, Tokyo, Toronto, Buenos Aires, Paris, Élodie knew her plane better than her own body. She knew every sound, every vibration. If something was wrong, she felt it with an almost animalistic instinct. One night, over the Atlantic, when everyone in the cockpit was asleep and the co-pilot had drunk coffee with a dose of drowsiness, Élodie sensed a slight change in pressure. She took control in a matter of seconds and avoided a depressurization that could have endangered the lives of 200 passengers. That day became legendary in the airline. But she didn't tell anyone that, while stabilizing the plane, she had just received an encrypted message from Youssef, her lover from Casablanca. She had learned to dissociate. Emotions were dangerous at over 10,000 feet, and the cockpit. Her voice was calm, metallic, trustworthy. The passengers adored her. They were delighted to hear a female pilot at the end of the flights. She often received notes written by excited children or mothers. "Thank you for making us fly with confidence." But no one knew that the woman who was getting off the plane was more than just a pilot. She was a code of riddles, a mother 7 times, a lover 7 times, a silent wife once. Her code imposed strict rules even outside the flight. She didn't wear perfume during flights, she didn't sleep in hotel rooms without checking every corner, she never left her luggage. She had 2 phones, one professional, one personal, and a third, unknown one, always hidden in a secret pocket in her suitcase. That phone was her connection to the 7 parallel lives. With the 7 hearts. She never got confused. She knew the exact time in each time zone. She knew that Naomi was going to school in Tokyo at the time that Isla woke up on the beaches of Australia. She knew when Marco, the restaurateur in Rome, finished work and sent poems. She knew when Youssef was in danger because of his political activity. But in front of her colleagues, she was just Élodie Moreau, the woman who had nothing to hide. She never complained about being tired. She flew 5-6 days in a row on continental flights. The pilot would sleep 4 hours, wake up, run to the hotel gym, and then go out on dates with her loves, without anyone knowing. She would return to the flight with her hair perfectly tied, with uniform without a crease. Once, a flight attendant said, "The commander never sweats, I think he's a robot." But he wasn't. She was just a woman who had elevated her own life to the level of a military operation, a mission, an art, a perfect flight. The women on the crew secretly admired her. One of them, Charlotte, had said to her one night, "Élodie, you don't just fly planes. You fly the world." But she didn't know how much truth was hidden in that joke. Sometimes, when she was alone in the air, when the clouds opened up beneath her like a sea of cotton and the sky was so blue that it looked painted, Élodie wondered if her code was actually a prison. Because even though she flew everywhere, she belonged nowhere. She had no home. She only had pressurized cabins, identical hotel rooms, and suitcases that never had time to gather dust. But she had no regrets. For her, freedom did not mean being anchored in one place, it meant being untouchable. And in flight, it was. The pilot's code did not let her make mistakes, nor love fully, nor confess. But it made her legendary. And in a world of men, Élodie Moreau had become not just an aircraft commander, but a living legend, symbol of total control of mystery of the sky that, although it never betrayed her, perfectly hid all her secrets. Chapter 17. Encounter with Death. At an altitude of 10,000 meters, where the sky becomes absolute silence and the blue is darker than the night on Earth, life can hang by an invisible thread. There, in that space suspended between worlds, Élodie Moreau first experienced the fragility of her own invincibility. Until then, she had been the queen of the sky, the mistress of a perfect illusion. But one January day, on a seemingly ordinary route between Paris and Johannesburg, everything would change. T was 03:10 GMT. The plane was flying at cruising altitude, and in the cockpit, Élodie was calmly discussing the weather forecast and the upcoming flights with the co-pilot. It seemed a quiet flight. Without turbulence, without challenges. In the back, 286 passengers were sleeping, dreaming, reading or watching films. To them, Élodie was just a voice on the loudspeakers, "Your flight commander." Everything collapsed in just a few seconds. A dry sound, followed by a dull vibration, preceded the disaster. The window on the left side of the cabin gave way. The pressure dropped suddenly, in a violent roar that seemed to tear the plane apart. The oxygen mask was torn off by the crazy wind. The air thinned in an instant, and with it, reality itself. Cockpit. Loss of pressure. "We are beginning an emergency descent," Élodie shouted, in a voice she wanted to be firm, but which trembled under the weight of death whispering in her ear. She felt that the air was no longer entering her lungs. Her fingers were turning blue, her head was throbbing, and part of her face had been cut off by the shards of the exploded window. She had no mask. She had no oxygen. Only willpower. She fought the pain, the cold that penetrated her bones, the chaos that had engulfed the plane. The descent was aggressive. The co-pilot, the young Emmerich Duval, was trying desperately to stay on course. But the plane, an Airbus A350, seemed to stop listening. The turbulence produced by the sudden drop shook everything. Luggage was falling, people were screaming, the stewards were struggling with the ceiling that seemed to collapse. But Élodie was there. With blood flowing from her temple, with her hands trembling, she continued to communicate with the control tower. This is Air France 473, emergency descent in progress. Window failure, loss of cabin pressure, ETA to Johannesburg revised. Something in her, a pilot's instinct that had never been defeated, kept her lucid. She had only one mission, to save all the passengers. Not for them to die on their day, but just a story that they would tell their grandchildren. After 13 minutes of hell, the plane had managed to descend to an altitude where breathing was possible again. Her oxygen mask, hanging uselessly, danced in the wind that was still penetrating through the broken window, partially covered by an emergency blanket held by Élodie with her bare hands. A long hour of tense silence followed, of checks, of fuel estimates, of procedures followed in cold blood. When the plane touched the runway in Johannesburg, and the wheels bit the asphalt with a loud crack, a wave of applause erupted from the cabin. No one knew exactly what had happened. They only knew that they were alive. That they had witnessed a miracle. Élodie descended from the cockpit holding on to the wall. The flight attendant wrapped her in a thermal blanket, but the blood could not be hidden. Not even the tremor in her gaze. She arrived at the hospital in shock, with a 17-centimeter cut on her face and symptoms of severe hypoxia. The doctors said she was a few minutes away from fainting. But she didn't stop. She didn't abandon her job. She sat there, her hands bloody on the steering wheel, thinking of her unseen daughters and the unwitting passengers. She didn't fly for 3 months. The company's psychologists tried to convince her to take medical leave. But Élodie was not a victim. She was a survivor. And beyond the visible trauma, more painful was the collapse of her personal myth. For the first time, she had been weak. For the first time, death had blown into the back of her head, showing her how close the end could be. Even for the goddess of the sky in her Paris apartment. At night she would wake up trembling. She could hear her breathing, he could taste the metallic taste of blood, he could see the passengers again, their eyes wide with panic. It was a recurring nightmare. But he didn't talk to anyone about it. Not even Armand, who never found out how serious the accident had been. Not even his daughter, not even his friends. He hid them, just as he had hidden his double life. With the same cold elegance. The newspapers wrote about her heroism, about the female pilot who saved almost 300 lives. Part of the public saw her as a modern goddess, but she felt that something had changed inside her. A thought had appeared, like a fine crack in the glass. What if next time she would not be so lucky? It was the first time she considered death not as a poetic abstraction, but as a reality. She began writing letters to her daughters, kept in safe deposit boxes, one for each. If I never come back, each one began. She told them that she loved them, even though she had not been a normal mother. That she knew them from the pictures, from the letters, from the smell of the city where she had left them. That, in her own strange way, she had loved them more than herself. When she returned to the cockpit, after 94 days, everyone looked at her differently. Not just with respect, but with the admiration reserved for those who had fought death and returned. But Élodie was no longer the same. She had a new voice in her head. One that asked her, "How long can you play this game? How long until one of your lies crashes lower than that plane?" She didn't know the answer, but she flew on. Because the sky was hers. And there, up there among the clouds, she found peace. Even when she feared it was the last time. Chapter 18. Suspicions. The days when Élodie Moreau flew freely over the oceans, her heart full of desires and her mind sharp with perfect plans, had begun to gather around her like a spider's web. Something in the air had changed, and not just in the sky. Colonel Armand Moreau, her husband of almost 20 years, had begun to see things he had ignored for years. Not because he was blind to reality, but because his love for Élodie had always been covered in a fog of admiration and military loyalty. But now, in retirement, back from theaters of operations and diplomatic missions, he had time to observe, time to feel. From the beginning, Armand had been fascinated by the strength and elegance of his wife. The legendary pilot, the woman who flew Boeings with the same naturalness with which she served a glass of wine at dinner. But in the quiet on their return home, in the evenings when there was no longer a mission to separate them, she began to count the things that didn't fit, the long silences, the smiles lost in memories. He didn't know, the strange sense of male perfume on the luggage. Élodie, where were you between the flight from Tokyo and the stopover in Rome? He had asked once, in an apparently casual tone. At the crew hotel, I had a safety meeting with the technical team. She had lied without blinking. She had smiled. She ran her fingers through her perfectly arranged hair and avoided eye contact. She knew that Armand was a master of reading micro-expressions, but also that his heart still refused to believe in betrayal. But it wasn't just Armand who was becoming more attentive. In Japan, Takahiro Watanabe had written her an email on a channel she had rarely used. He was telling her that Naomi wanted to see her more often. Their little girl, silent and profound, was beginning to feel the absence of her mother like a wound. In Kenya, Kofa had become more tender, more direct. He had begun to dream of a life together, of a medical center opened with international funds, of a family under the same roof. Élodie, why don't you stay longer? At least a month? Or a year? I can fly to France if necessary. But I need to know what you really want, he had told her, looking at her with eyes so clear that they almost made her give up everything. What do I really want? She repeated to herself as she rose to 10,000 feet on a flight between Paris and Buenos Aires. Behind her, the crew greeted her respectfully, and front, the endless sky. But inside her, storms were starting to rise. The calendar was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Intercontinental flights, strategic stopovers, encrypted messages with precise times and locations. Sometimes, she wrote down her dates coded in a leather notebook, hidden in a pocket of her carry-on luggage. Each day she lived to become a balancing act between passion, lies, and impeccable professionalism. But one detail slipped through her impenetrable defenses. One night, after had returned from a long flight from Casablanca, Armand found a small brooch, worked in silver, in the shape of a Berber.It was not Élodie's style. She did not wear such jewelry. And it had never been a gift from him. The next day, he had asked her jokingly, "Have we started collecting Oriental souvenirs?" Élodie was not lost in her nature. She smiled and said, "A gift from a Moroccan stewardess. I had a layover with her. She gave it to me as a sign of friendship." But her heart was pounding in her chest as if it were her first parachute jump. Even more dangerous. Liam Hunter from Sydney had found out that she had been seen in Rome on a weekend when she had told him she was at flight simulators in Frankfurt. He had written her a one-line message. "Have you been to Marco's?" Marco, the Italian artist. The one who had painted her like a goddess, and who, in turn, had begun to lose control. The last time they had seen each other, he had told her that he wanted her only for himself. "If you don't come, I'll go to Paris. I want to meet my daughter," she had said in a low, almost threatening voice. And so the crack in Élodie's perfect wall began to widen. Each of the 7 men felt, in different ways, that something was missing. Each child was growing up and demanding more maternal presence. And Armand, the silent one and seemingly defeated by life, was becoming an observing shadow. One summer evening, in the garden of their villa near Toulouse, Armand looked at her for a long time. In his hands he held a photograph. It was not recent. But in it, Élodie was standing next to Youssef Ben Modi in Casablanca. They were both laughing. It was an image captured from an unusual angle, probably by a paparazzo or a friend of Armand's in the secret services. "You told me you hadn't been to Morocco in recent years," Armand said simply. "I don't remember telling you that," she replied, tense. "Maybe you didn't tell me. Maybe you were silent." That moment, Élodie understood. Her husband was no longer blind. He didn't accuse her, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't scold her. But in that oppressive silence, there was the judgment of a man who knew, or at least, he had begun to know. From now on, the game was no longer just about dividing his life into continents and timetables. It was about survival. About choice. About truth and illusions. That same evening, in the cabin of the plane taking off for Tokyo, Élodie looked at her reflection in the window. Her blonde hair tied in an elegant bun, her perfect uniform, her eyes as blue as ice. Beyond it all, a woman torn between 7 men, 7 daughters, and a husband who had finally begun to truly see her. And maybe, to love her with lucidity. But was it too late? Chapter 19. Encounter with the past. Tokyo had always seemed to Élodie a silent and at the same time deafening city, metropolis where no one shouted, but everything vibrated. Glass and steel buildings that rose like cold memories. The discreet sound of footsteps on impeccable sidewalks, the illuminated advertisements that promised nothing real, city where every secret could be elegantly hidden. This time, however, the stopover was not an ordinary one. There was no simulation program, no meetings with the staff. She had only one desire, to see Naomi. The little girl she had given birth to in secret 8 years ago, in the discreet hospital of an expat neighborhood in Osaka, had become a constant presence in her thoughts. Takahiro Watanabe, the girl's father, had kept in touch with Élodie regularly, but with a respectful distance, had agreed to the silence, with discretion, with Élodie's elaborate plan of sharing her love between heaven and earth, between men and daughters, without ever being fully there. But Naomi had grown up. She was no longer a porcelain doll who could be entertained with drawings or ice cream. She was a sensitive child, with deep, night-black eyes, and a precocious intelligence, child who was beginning to ask questions. They had met in a hidden tea-house, overlooking a small Zen garden. Naomi, in her white dress with a cherry blossom print, looked at Élodie with a kind of solemnity that crushed her inside. Takahiro had kept his distance. He had left them alone, citing an urgent call from a university. The truth was that he felt that this moment did not belong to him. "Naomi, how good it is to see you again," Élodie began, her voice trembling, taking her small hands in hers. "I know you," the little girl said. "Not like a lady from the flight. I know you from dreams. And from my eyes, I have the same color as you." Élodie felt a lump rise in her throat, an old pressure, which she had kept buried in the deepest layers of her being. "Naomi, I am here because I want you to know the truth." The little girl did not blink. She did not smile. She did not play. She spoke clearly. "You are my mother, aren't you?" Silence settled between them like hot steam. Élodie nodded. Tears rose to her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "Yes, I am your mother. And I am so sorry that I was not by your side every day." Naomi lowered her gaze to her small hands, which she gently withdrew. "Why didn't you stay with me?" That question, said simply, without reproach, had the power of a knife. He cut through her air, her memory, all her justifications. How do you tell a little girl that you chose freedom, or her illusion? That you tried to love everyone without belonging to anyone? That you wanted to be a mother, but you couldn't afford to be just a mother? "Because I was a coward," Élodie said, looking at her child. "Because I was afraid that I didn't know how to love. And because I thought that, from afar, I could be your mother in silence." Naomi looked at her again. The little girl's tears were not flowing, but her eyes were filled. "I forgive you. But you have to teach me not to feel invisible anymore." That sentence broke Élodie's heart in two. In front of her was no longer just a little girl. She was a mirror of her own childhood, of her own wounds. Hers, Élodie, who had grown up between two silences, an absent mother and a severe father. And now, history was repeating itself. "You are not invisible, Naomi. You are all that I have most precious. And if you want, I can start writing to you every day. Let's see each other more often. Come when you want. Then, can you come for Christmas?" The question was simple, but the answer was no. Christmas was the time when she usually went to Argentina, to Isabella's, was the time when every father wanted to have Élodie close and every child waited for a promise. But at that moment, looking at Naomi, Élodie understood that she could no longer run away. Not without losing everything. "Yes, I'll come for Christmas, I promise." The little girl smiled. It was a shy but real smile. And Élodie knew that it was the first time that Naomi looked at her not as a distant star, but as a real person. After the meeting, she returned to the hotel trembling. She closed the door of her room and cried. Not as a woman, but as a daughter, as a mother, as a being torn to pieces. She called Takahiro. She told him that something had to change. "I want Naomi to come to Paris this summer. I want to show her my world. Let's not be shadows anymore." To the end of the line, Takahiro fell silent. Then he said simply, "You've taken the first step. The rest will come." That night, Élodie opened her laptop and began to write. Not a diary, but a series of letters. One for each daughter. Began with Naomi. "Naomi, my little girl. I'm writing to you because I don't want to talk to you from the shadows anymore. You're a light in my life, and I made a mistake by keeping you away. I was afraid, and sometimes fear steals not only your courage, but also your truth. I love you. And I will learn to show you that not only through words, but through my presence. I may not be the perfect mother, but I want to be your mother. After Naomi, he wrote to Isabella. Then to Aila. Then to the little girl in Morocco. One by one, with a heavy heart and a trembling hand. Meeting Naomi had not just been a step into the truth, it had been a portal to beginning, path that could not be closed. The past was no longer just a suitcase locked in the vault of memories. The past was alive, and her little girls were its mirror. The years had passed over Élodie Moreau with a feline grace, but also with a weight that even flying could no longer lift. 60, she still wore her pilot's uniform like an invincible suit of armor, but inside her, restlessness had begun to boil. There had been decades of perfect balancing, a life fragmented into continents, fragments of love, coded letters and little girls raised in the shadow of their fathers. Now, all the pieces were starting to move towards an inevitable collision. The first signs came. Not from heaven, but from the ground. Layla, the daughter born in Casablanca, had sent a letter to France, addressed to her mother. But she had made the wrong initials on the envelope. The letter was intercepted, by chance or fate, by Armand Moreau. The faithful, disciplined, perhaps overconfident husband had read the lines with a hardened heart. Mother, when will you tell me the truth? My father never wants to talk about you. He only says that you were a bird with wounded wings. But I know you exist. I dreamed of you. It was not the signature of a lost daughter, but of a forgotten love, transformed into flesh and dreams. Armand said nothing at that moment, but his eyes took on a tremor that Élodie had not seen since his military missions in the Congo. His silence had become oppressive, full of unasked questions. He had begun to look at her differently, more attentively, colder, as if he were re-evaluating her after an immense inner process. At the same time, the girls had also begun to feel a strange calling, an invisible thread that united them. Over the years, Élodie had visited them under different identities: a family friend, a pilot lady, a mentor to their father. Now they were on the verge of adulthood. Naomi, already in Tokyo, had asked the first frontal question, and Élodie had made an irreparable mistake. She had told the truth. With a trembling voice and wet eyes, she had told him, "Yes, I am your mother. But I can't be just yours." And that truth had been a liberation and a curse. Osha, from Nairobi, had started writing to her more often, with questions about identity. Isla, from Sydney, had started looking through old files and articles about Élodie. Amelie, from New York, had come across a photo of herself and Takahiro Watanabe, from 25 years ago, in which Élodie was wearing the same pendant he had given her daughter. Chiara, from Rome, had asked her father, "Why do you always tell me that my mother was she a muse and not a man? Was she ever real?" In Élodie's heart, all these echoes became a dizzying chorus. Flights, once comfort and escape, had begun to seem long, heavy, tiring. The time in the air was no longer enough to hide from her own conscience. When she took off, she always asked herself, what will fall first, the plane or the lie? One morning, before a flight to Buenos Aires, Élodie looked at herself in the mirror of her Paris hotel. Her once burning blue eyes were now the hue of melted ice. Her body, always impeccable, was beginning to show signs of fatigue. Her fingers sometimes trembled on the sleeve. She remembered how she had met Jackson Carter, the first man she had truly loved, and how she had given birth secretly in New York, without any of her colleagues knowing. Back then, she was convinced she could control everything. But now? A fellow co-pilot, 30 years younger, had jokingly asked her in the cockpit, "Élodie, do you really have no connection to the earth? It's like you don't belong to any story." And she had smiled bitterly. That was, in fact, the great illusion, to belong to no one, but in reality, she belonged to every daughter, every beloved man, every unspoken secret. A stopover in Casablanca, Youssef had greeted her with a bouquet of jasmine and a simple but sharp question. "Layla has dreams in which you call her. What should I say to her when she cries at night?" Élodie fell silent. She could neither say, "I'm coming," nor "I'm not your mother," because she was both. When she left for her next destination, she couldn't sleep on the plane. She began to write in a diary. "Everything is cracking. The wall is breaking. Flying can't save me anymore. One rainy evening in Rome, Marco Bellini sent her a line from an unfinished painting, a woman with angel wings but sad eyes, surrounded by 7 colorful birds, each flying in a different direction. Under the picture he wrote, "I know. Even angels don't escape the truth." As her suspicions grew, Élodie began to fear. Not the judgment of others, but the impact the truth would have on her daughters. She had raised them indirectly, but with love. She had protected them, but denied them the right to a mother. In a moment of sincerity, she had written a letter for each one, which she kept in an encrypted folder on her personal laptop. Some began with, "Forgive me for not being there when you said the first word." Others said, "I was next to you, but you didn't recognize me." The days became increasingly fragile. On a flight between Paris and Nairobi, a passenger had a seizure, and Élodie felt useless. She sat with her hand clenched on the steering wheel, but her heart was elsewhere. It was the first time she had ever wanted to be on the ground, to be home. But where was home? Chapter 20. The Anniversary. It was a clear summer day, and the villa on the Côte d'Azur seemed to have come out of an impressionist painting. The sun was slowly setting over the calm waves, reflecting in the large windows of Élodie Moreau's residence. She was already almost 80 years old and, for the first time in her life, she was no longer flying anywhere. She had no schedule, no terminal in front of her, no flight code to memorize. She only had a calendar with a single day circled, today. The day she would tell the hardest truth. She had called all 7 of her daughters, each raised on a different continent, each with a different father, each carrying an untold story. She had invited them under the pretext of a special anniversary, a unique reunion, a moment to celebrate life. But in reality, it was about the beginning of an unburdening, perhaps of a process of forgiveness, or at least, a dialogue with the truth. Each daughter had been brought there with care. Asha from Nairobi, director of a non-governmental organization, came with the baggage of African worries and the smile of the mother who had been absent. Naomi from Tokyo, a researcher in artificial intelligence, wore the silence characteristic of her culture, but her eyes betrayed a restless curiosity. Isla, a marine biologist from Australia, was exuberant, but she felt like a fish out of water in the restrained atmosphere of the meeting. Chiara from Rome, an art restorer, had the melancholy of old canvases in her eyes. Layla from Casablanca, a poet and activist, always seemed on the verge of protest. Amelie from New York, a journalist, had already suspected that this reunion had more layers than it seemed. And Isabella, the daughter raised in Paris, the only one that Élodie had partially raised, seemed somehow prepared. They gathered in the living room main, where an oil portrait dominated the room. It had been painted by Marco Bellini decades ago. There she was, the queen of the air, in her pilot's uniform, with her enigmatic smile and her blonde hair tied in a coquettish ponytail. "I called you here, because the time has come for you to know everything," Élodie began, her voice trembling slightly, but remaining firm. "I have lived a double life, maybe even multiple. I have loved each of you. But I have loved you in the shadows. The truth is that I am your mother. Yours, all of you." The silence was sharper than any outburst. For a few moments, only the waves could be heard, and Élodie's heart beating with an almost painful intensity. Amelie was the first to break the silence. The journalist in her could no longer keep the mystery. "I expected it. Too many things didn't connect. Letters without names. Gifts from the same European stores. And our eyes. We all have the same look, mother." The word mother said so easily brought tears to Élodie's eyes. She didn't expect acceptance. She expected anger. But the anger didn't delay. Layla slid up and walked to the window, her back to everything else. "You left us. Each of us. You offered us only a few letters, a few secret visits. You tore us out of a complete life. You made us daughters of the shadow." "I didn't abandon you, Layla," Élodie whispered. "I protected you. None of your fathers knew about the others. Not even you. T was the only way I could give you a normal life. If there's one thing I've learned as a pilot, it's that direction is everything. And sometimes direction involves sacrifice." Naomi approached, calm but with red eyes. "Why did you only come to me twice as a child?" "I looked up at the sky and hoped to see you land." Élodie smiled sadly. "Because if I had come more often, I wouldn't have been able to leave." Chiara, in a soft voice, asked, "And did your husband know? Armand?" No, he was always devoted to France. He lived in the discipline of the army. He never saw what I did during the stopovers. I loved him in my own way. But my love had 7 hearts, 7 faces. Isla smiled, ironically. You were a kind of James Bond of aviation. Or a mother.Her with a pilot's license. How did you manage not to get confused? With a calendar in 3 languages and a soul in 7 pieces, Élodie answered. And with a mathematical mind. But at some point, fatigue set in. And fear, so I decided to stop, to let the past catch up with me. Asha, always balanced, asked a simple question. Did you love us? Élodie closed her eyes for a moment. Then she answered. With an intensity that I cannot express. You are the 7 continents of my heart. Without you, my life would have been just a flight without a destination. Silence fell again. But it was a different silence, a dense one, not oppressive. The girls looked at each other's faces, trying to recognize in their features fragments of commonality. Cheekbones, chins, smiles. They were so different, and yet, they carried an invisible legacy, Élodie Moreau. Élodie took out a thin folder and placed it on the table. There were letters for each daughter, written over the years. Unsent. Testimonies of the desire for closeness. Flight logs and mother's diaries. Here are years of repressed desire. Someday you will read it, or maybe not. But I didn't want to leave this world without you knowing who you are. And who am I? Not all the daughters accepted immediately. Some left early, confused, torn between the new reality and the known life. Others stayed, to talk, to try to get closer. But the seed of truth had been planted. Regardless of the reaction, nothing could be the same again. That night, Élodie climbed alone onto the terrace of the house. The sky was clear, sprinkled with stars. She knew them by heart, after so many years of flying. But now, she saw them with different eyes. They were witnesses to her life. And perhaps, one day, witnesses to forgiveness. Chapter 21. The Last Flight. Élodie Moreau knew that every flight has a beginning and an end. For her, however, the end was much harder to accept than the beginning. After almost 40 years in which the sky had been her home, her comrade, and the only place where she felt truly free, she was preparing to officially retire from aviation. The last flight would take her back to Nairobi, where Asha, her daughter with humanitarian Dr. Kofa Abasai, was waiting for her with open arms, but also with an emotional charge that neither of them could avoid. The morning began with the pale light of dawn, penetrating through the white curtains of her Paris apartment. Élodie was making the final preparations, impeccable uniforms, checklists, and a heavy knot in her stomach that she carefully hid under the professional smile of a pilot. All her colleagues knew that it was the big day, that everything was ending. Some of them gave her a standing ovation, others let tears flow in silence. For Élodie, however, the emotion was completely different. It was a mixture of fear, gratitude, and sadness. And the plane cabin, she pressed the buttons, checked the controls, followed the indicators. The cold air was entering through the ventilation system, and the sound of the engines began to sing her the final melody of an exceptional career. Captain Élodie Moreau was no longer just a female pilot with blue eyes and blonde hair, but a legend in the world of aviation. Tens of thousands of flight hours, thousands of passengers transported safely, but above all a life lived with intensity in every kilometer traveled. As the plane climbed onto the runway of Charles de Gaulle Airport, Élodie felt like her entire existence was caught between 2 worlds, one beyond the clouds, in which she flew carefree, and the other terrestrial, in which she had to stop. Her thoughts flew to all her daughters, and each of them lived a part of her story, and each brought with it a unique love, a well-guarded secret. The flight to Nairobi would be the last, not only in her career as a pilot, but also in the adventurous life of a woman who, although strong and independent, she had never given up on her dreams. The aircraft crossed continents, crossed oceans, and Élodie contemplated with a lump in her throat the landscapes that unfolded beneath her wheels. Dense forests, vibrant cities, deserts and snowy mountains, each of them reminded her of a stage in her life. She knew that in Nairobi, not only a daughter awaited her, but a whole world of emotions and discoveries. The descent to Jomo Kenyatta Airport was smooth, and when the wheels touched the African asphalt, a humid warmth caressed her face. The air of Nairobi was different, charged with the smell of earth, freshly cut grass and exotic flowers. Asha was there, at the end of the runway, with her arms outstretched, her eyes shining with tears and a smile that cut through the hard wall of the past for a moment. When they arrived in the VIP lounge, the silence that reigned seemed almost sacred. Every second was filled with emotion, with unspoken words, with gestures that said more than any statement. Élodie hugged Osha with all the strength she still had in her, and the tears began to flow uncontrollably. It was the first time in many years that she had truly cried, without shame and without fear of judgment. The crying in the cockpit, during the last flight, had been different. Back then, between the electrical circuits and instruments, between the heights of the sky and human fragility, part of her burden had been released. Now, in Nairobi, it was a cry that brought reconciliation with herself, with the past, with all the choices she had made. It was the tale of a woman who had learned that true love was not just about physical presence, but also acceptance and forgiveness. And the following days, Élodie and Osha spent hours talking about everything that had been hidden. About childhood, about fathers, about the pain of a child who had lost his looking for her mother, and about a woman who divided her heart into 7 parts. They laughed, they cried, they argued, and they forgave each other. Osha showed her photos of her daughters, the projects she worked on, and the people she had helped in the medical camps. Élodie felt for the first time in a long time that she had a solid root in this world, a corner of the world that she could call home. In a moment of silence, Élodie looked at the African sky through the living room window and remembered those nights when, as a child, she dreamed of flying. Now, on the verge of retirement, she understood that her flight had not only been about conquering the sky, but about finding fragments of herself in every corner of the world. The last flight had also been the beginning of a new life, one in which she was no longer just a pilot, but a mother, a woman, and above all a person who accepts the imperfection and complexity of love. That evening, Élodie wrote a letter to each of her 7 daughters. She placed them beautifully in a box, next to a medallion with the symbol of infinity, a sign that her love for them would never cease, regardless of distance or time. Before going to bed, she put her uniform on the hanger, preparing it for the last time, then closed her eyes with a feeling of reconciliation that she had not known in a long time. Now, she was ready to live her life with everything it brought, without flights, without hiding places, only with the truth and true love that came, finally, from the heart. Chapter 22. The Legacy. Once the walls of silence fell, and the secret paths opened, life began to take on a new shape for the 7 daughters of Élodie Moreau. First, their meetings were awkward, fraught with hesitation and unanswered questions. But with each moment spent together, with each conversation whispered or spoken aloud, the word sister began to take on a meaning that was both painful and magical. In an elegant corner of the villa on the Côte d'Azur, Osha, who had always been the calm and balanced soul of the group, gathered them all in a circle. Her warm smile, but also her gaze, in which a deep sadness could be read, brought a special energy. Osha was not only the daughter of a humanitarian doctor, but also a silent binder, a bridge between continents and destinies. "It took us a long time to get here," she said, looking at each face differently. "But now we are here, and we have something that neither of us can take from the other, our heritage. Not just blood, but also the stories, dreams, sufferings and joys of our mother." Each girl was a reflection of Élodie, but also of her father. Amélie, the American journalist, carried the fire of passion and permanent questioning in her eyes. She was always ready to face the world with her truth. Naomi, silent and introspective, brought a discreet elegance and inner strength. Isla, with her soul as an explorer and lover of nature, radiated a simple joy. Chiara, artistic and melancholic, brought depth of feeling. Layla, with her revolutionary spirit and poetic voice, instilled courage and the need for justice. Isabella, the daughter raised almost under Élodie's eyes, was their anchor, a family bond that kept the bond alive. The first days were full of stories about childhood, about fathers, about the desire to know more than just fragments. They began to share secrets, but also fears. How to define themselves as sisters, when their whole lives were separated, raised in such different worlds. How to forgive a mother who chose them to live in the shadows. As everyone began to speak, the atmosphere heated up. Amélie told of the nights she spent writing articles about women's rights, thinking of her mother as a silent heroine. Naomi told of the loneliness in Tokyo, how she had found solace in her research work, but also of the longing for her roots. Isla told of the days spent on the beaches of Australia, where she felt free, but always with a piece of her heart missing. Chiara described how her paintings came to life under the brush of the artist who had inspired their mother. Layla spoke passionately about the fight for justice and how poetry helped her express her pain and hope. Isabella, who knew them all, always brought a balance, a bridge between contradictory emotions. In one of the quiet moments, Osha took out an old trunk she had brought from Nairobi. Inside were letters, diaries, photographs, small objects that Élodie had carefully collected over the years. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by the girls, the trunk became a symbol of the past, but also of their connection. Each object had a story, and the stories were the knots that held them together. "This is the locket that our mother wore when she took her first flight to Buenos Aires," Isabella said, carefully removing a small velvet jewel. "And this is the journal in which she wrote about each of us, even when she was not with us." Each girl took one object in her hand, feeling for the first time a true connection with their mother. And implicitly, with the others. The time spent together slowly began to change their perception of each other. They understood that they were not rivals, but complements. Pieces of a complex puzzle, a mosaic of intertwined lives. In their eyes, the hope that they could build a real family, even if belated, began to shine. Élodie watched from a distance, with overwhelming emotion. Every moment her girls came closer was a reward for years of sacrifices and necessary lies. She watched them laugh, cry, argue, reconcile. She was aware that the road would not be easy, but in that room full of different perfumes, of jasmine, of the Australian sea, of African dust, a new life was being born. In those days, the first bonds were formed. Osha and Layla began to share their humanitarian projects, promising to collaborate in the future. Amelie began to teach Liam, her brother from another continent, how to express his thoughts in writing, an activity that brought her an unexpected connection. Naomi and Chiara discussed art and technology, finding common ground in creativity and logic. Isabella was the bridge that held everything together, guiding them with calm and patience. Their legacy was not just a matter of blood, but of bonds built every day, of trust and hard-won love. And even though many questions still remained unanswered, each girl was beginning to understand her role in this complex story. One evening, under the starry sky of on the Côte d'Azur, all seven gathered on the terrace of the villa. The wind blew gently, bringing the sense of all the continents they represented. They raised a toast to their mother, to Élodie, the woman who gave them life and who now offered them the truth. "Let us be sisters, even if life has allowed us to discover each other late," said Amelie, with tears in her eyes. "Let us support each other, because in this lies true strength," added Layla. "And let us never forget that in each of us there is a part of our mother," concluded Isabella. Élodie looked at them and felt a wave of tranquility and peace fill her heart. Her legacy was alive, not only in blood, but in the bonds created, in the hopes and love they now shared. Chapter 23. The Final Interview. In a bright and tidy office in Paris, Camille, the young and ambitious journalist, sat down in front of an old tape recorder, her eyes still moist from her last meeting with Élodie Moreau. The recording had been made a few days earlier, in an intimate setting, in the legendary pilot's house, where the story of a completely unusual life came to life for the first time in front of an attentive witness. Camille turned on the recorder with trembling hands. Élodie's warm but burdened voice filled the room, and her words resonated with a force that went beyond the banality of a simple interview. It was an authentic confession, a testament to life, a journey through the secrets of a woman who had flown among clouds and secrets for almost 8 decades. "My name is Élodie Moreau," the soft voice began, "and I have lived a life that few could understand. I was an airline pilot. I have traveled the world. I have loved 7 men and raised 7 daughters in the shadows. Now, at 79 years old, I choose to tell everything." Camille felt a deep emotion take hold of her. She had learned a lot about Élodie from previous accounts, but she had never heard her speak with such sincerity, with that vulnerability that also revealed immense power. As the recording continued, Élodie's voice carried them on routes from New York to Buenos Aires, from Nairobi to Tokyo, from Sydney to Rome and Casablanca. The cities where the seeds of her loves had been, the cities where her daughters had been born. Each fragment of the story was loaded with emotions, passion, pain, regret, hope. Camille felt the face of a woman who had not only been an impeccable pilot, but a complex being, with burning desires and a hidden life full of sacrifices, take shape. Élodie's confession became a lesson in courage, in the double game of life, and in the power to face the truth. As the story reached the moment when Élodie decided to bring her daughters together, Camille remembered her encounter with each of them. Their silence and emotion in the face of the truth, the hope that was born, but also the pains that were still not shared. Listening carefully, Camille now understood what the word family had truly meant to this woman, a fragile but undefeated concept. The recording continued with passages about the last flight, about the tears shed in the cockpit, about how Élodie had found peace and reconciliation with herself. T was an authentic portrait of a life lived in contrast, between heaven and earth, between appearance and essence, between love and sacrifice. As she listened, Camille felt her eyes grow moist. It was not only admiration for a legend, but also an emotion deep for the humanity that the story revealed. She realized that in front of her was not just a pilot who had conquered the sky, but a woman who had learned to love with all her heart, even when life had forced her to love in silence. After the recording ended, Camille remained motionless for a few moments, her thoughts enveloped in the echo of the words. She knew that she had in front of her a story that would change the perception of the woman Élodie Moreau. She was not just an adventurer of the sky, but a symbol of courage, of the complexity of the human soul and of the power to come to terms with the past, with a new inspiration. The journalist began to write down her thoughts, to prepare to bring the world the truth about Élodie. In front of her, the story of a life that was not measured in years, but in the intensity of loves, in the hidden secrets and in the flights that became a metaphor for the struggle between light and shadow. Camille cried in silence, aware that she had met a living legend, a woman whose secrets, at last, could illuminate and inspire. Chapter 24. The Woman Who Loved the Sky. Élodie Moreau had lived her life as a daring flight through the infinite sky, with every moment filled with courage, passion and an unquenchable thirst to live beyond limits. 79 years old, with 7 daughters grown and their destinies sealed, with secrets revealed and stories told, Élodie had finally found peace. Her room was a sanctuary of memories. On the bedside table, in a simple frame, stood a photograph of the 7 girls, each with unique features, but with eyes that reflected the same spark, the same invisible heritage. The photograph watched over Élodie in those last moments, and she knew that, regardless of distance or time, those faces were the purest, truest part of her. With her breathing calm and a gentle smile on her lips, Élodie let herself be carried away by memories. Images of airport runways around the world played out in her mind, the sound of the engines, the sensation of absolute freedom when the plane took off, the wind caressing her face. T was the flight that had defined her, the flight that had made her feel alive and whole. But above all, she remembered each of her daughters, the love she had experienced, the secrets she had carefully hidden, the sacrifices she had made so that they could have a normal life. At that moment, nothing else mattered but the immense love that bound her to them. The world outside was hectic, but in Élodie's room a deep peace reigned, like a warm summer afternoon, when everything seems to stand still for a moment of reflection. She knew that her story would endure, not just as a simple aviation legend, but as a testimony to the courage of a woman who defied not only the gravity of the earth, but also the gravity of the heart. In recent weeks, her story had been published in the most important magazines and newspapers. The interviews, diaries and testimonies of the 7 daughters created a wave of emotion and admiration around the world. Readers were amazed to discover that behind the pilot's legend was a woman with a much more complex life, with daring loves and a heart divided into 7. An article in Le Monde called her the woman who flew beyond the limits. And an international aviation magazine dedicated a special file to her entitled, "The Sky Was Never Enough for Élodie Moreau." On social networks, stories about her brought thousands of comments, messages of admiration and gratitude for a life lived on their own, without regrets. In the house in Paris, the atmosphere was charged with emotion. The 7 girls had come from all corners of the world to say goodbye to their mother. It was a reunion unlike any before. It was the last. It was a celebration of a life and the beginning of a legacy that would last over time. Each brought a symbolic gift. Osha brought an acacia plant, a symbol of African resistance. Naomi brought a delicate ikebana, as a sign of harmony and balance. Isla brought a shell collected from Australian beaches. Chiara a small painted canvas. Layla a collection of poems. Amelie a book with reports about strong women. And Elise brought a photo of Élodie as a child, to remind them of the beginnings. Before Élodie closed her eyes forever, each girl placed her hand over hers. A deep and soothing, a silent promise that they would keep their mother's legacy alive, not just blood, but courage, love, and the desire for freedom. Her bedside, a diary was open, with the last handwritten words. I loved the sky, because there I felt freed. I loved life, because in it I found the true meaning of love. You, my girls, are the stars that light my path. Do not be afraid to fly, even if the wind is sometimes against you. Her words remained engraved not only on paper, but in the hearts of those who knew her. In her final moments, Élodie passed away peacefully, with the photo of her 7 girls by her bed, with a smile of reconciliation and a heart at peace that her story would not be forgotten. And so, the woman who loved the sky finally found her home, in the unconditional love of her daughters. Her, in the memory of those who read and were inspired by her life, in the eternal sky she conquered with every flight. Chapter 25. Goodbye. The summer sun burned with a gentle warmth over the quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Paris, where the simple tomb of Colonel Armand Moreau stands. It was a day with a clear sky, without a single cloud, as if nature itself wanted to pay homage to a man who, during his lifetime, had been more of a mute presence, a loving but unaware shadow. Next to it, another tomb had recently been placed, that of Élodie Moreau. The 2 tombstones stood side by side, joined in silence, symbolizing a bond that had not been fully revealed during their lives, but which now, after their passing, seemed stronger than ever. Although Armand had died 3 years ago, without knowing the truth about his wife's double life, his heart remained a mystery, silent heart that had never suspected the adventures, the secrets and the loves that had animated Élodie's life. He had remained in the shadows, a pillar of their marriage, an honest and devoted partner, but absent from many essential moments. The day of Élodie's funeral had brought together people from all corners of the world in one place. The 7 girls, each with her own story and legacy, came to lead their mother on her last journey. It was a solemn reunion, but also full of emotion, a family united in mourning and love. At the end of the alley, a priest held the service, with a soft voice and words that echoed among the crosses and cypresses. It spoke of a woman who flew in life and soul, of her fragmented but wholesome love, and of the courage to live by her own rules, even if they were hidden from the eyes of the world. The girls laid flowers on Élodie's grave, mixed bouquet that included white roses for purity, orchids for refinement, lilacs for mystery, and red carnations for passion and the deep silence. Each placement was a silent dialogue with their mother, a promise that her story would remain alive. Those present noted the discreet presence of several former guild colleagues, pilots and crew members, who respected her for the professionalism and strength with which she dominated a complicated and often male-dominated world. It was a tacit recognition of an impeccable career and a life lived in tandem with the sky. And the corner of the cemetery, Camille, the journalist who had listened to her confessions and story, watched with moist eyes and deep thoughts. For her, this funeral was not just the end of a life, but the beginning of a literary legacy that would inspire generations. Far from all this, in the heart of Paris, 7 girls remained united, surrounded by memories and the invisible bond of the maternal breast. That day, they fully understood the complexity of a woman who chose to be many, to live many lives, but who finally found rest next to the man she loved, even if he had never known her truth. When the gravediggers finished the ceremony and covered the grave, a light wind passed over the cemetery, bringing with it an almost imperceptible whisper, a murmur of the sky that seemed to say that, finally, 2 souls had found each other. And so, life took its course, leaving behind a legend, the story of a woman who conquered the sky, defied the gravity of the heart, and lived a life that ultimately became a symbol of love and courage. Epilogue. Years have passed since Élodie Moreau left both heaven and earth. In her wake, there are not only flights recorded in the company's logs, but 7 hearts that bear the name of a mother in a whisper, in a different language, but with the same emotion. Each daughter grew up differently, one in the heat of Morocco, another in the cold of Scandinavia, one on the shores of the Bosphorus, another under the sun of Kenya, but all, without knowing it, carried within them a part of the same woman. Her story, when it was published, caused a wave of astonishment, revolt, admiration and tears. Some condemned her. Others understood her. But no one remained indifferent. In a world that demands order, fidelity, clear labels, Élodie chose the emotional disorder of a life lived in shades, not in black and white. She loved without permission. She was a mother in secret. She flew like a bird that she knew that if she stopped, she would fall. Her simple grave, next to that of Colonel Armand Moreau, the man who was her husband, but never her whole story. The girls come one by one, not all of them. Some come with flowers. Others only with questions. But all of them learn, slowly, that blood is not the only bridge. That the truth hurts, but can bring liberation. An aviation museum has preserved her uniform. A classroom for young female pilots is named Élodie Moreau. But the true legacy is not there. It is in the courage to live with a multiple heart, in the silence that covered sacrifices, in the whispers that one day become the voices of one's own daughters. The Great Confession is not a story about perfection. It is the story of a woman who defied gravity, not only of the body, but of lies, of love, of motherhood. And in her wake, a lesson remained, that sometimes even sin hides within it a form of absolute love.